Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2026. We've received apologies from Claire Adamson. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence on Scottish broadcasting, the BBC Charter Renewal and the BBC Annual Report. And we're joined today by Hayley Valentine, Director, and Louis Thornton, Head of Multi-Platform Commissioning at BBC Scotland, Luke McCulloch, Corporate Affairs Director, Nations, and Rona Burns, Finance Director, Financial Planning and Insight at the BBC. Welcome to you all, and I'll begin by inviting Ms Valentine to make a short opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us. The media and broadcast sector is in the middle of a period of change which I think is more rapid and transformative than anything that I've seen in my career. It's driven by technology, and the sector is completely changing. In the last decade, we've gone from effectively a live, linear schedule with limited choice to an on-demand world where we can choose what, when and where we consume our content from effectively a whole world of choice. In news in particular, there are now many more ways that people can find out about what is going on locally or globally, not all of them reliable. In this world, I think the BBC is more important than ever. We need to provide a distinctive, trustworthy, tailored service for the licence fee payer, reaching audiences wherever they are and with news that is both relevant and local while explaining and analysing the bigger picture of world events. We need to create more content that reflects their lives, covering the culture, music, events, sport that matters to them, and compete on quality with the international streamers whose drama budgets are in some cases rivalling blockbuster films. For the BBC, serving audiences wherever and whenever they want us to has brought about huge change. Rather than being schedule or channel driven, we commission and make content to deliver to all of our platforms and many third-party ones. We make multiple versions of our news stories tailored for many different audience needs. We make fewer, bigger, more ambitious drama, comedy and factual programmes which serve audiences here, but also take Scottish stories across the world. We're seeing a huge amount of consolidation in the market where companies have umbrella owners and greater partnering to meet the budget requirements of modern television in particular. And as we see some of our industry withdraw from both the number of commissions that they give to the Scottish sector and coverage of the whole of Scotland, we know how vital our work is in supporting the sector, training for the future and serving audiences across all of Scotland. All of this is happening while we manage significant budget pressures of our own and continue to serve many people who still rely on linear services. Despite the challenges, I think the health of the sector is really good, and the broader industry in Scotland can really capitalise on the changes and the opportunities that I've outlined. And finally, to touch on Charter. What our BBC Audience Survey told us is that as well as an independence from governments, what people want is high-quality entertainment, drama and comedy, as well as the programmes which educate and inform. And they want to see themselves and their lives reflected in the programmes that we make. We would ask for the flexibility to respond and change as quickly as our commercial rivals, and long-term sustainable funding to enable us to do that. What we really want is you in this room, your colleagues in this building, and all of your constituents across Scotland to make your voices heard in the conversation about our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I bring in colleagues who will want to ask questions, I've got a few questions myself. A broad opening question for you, Ms Valentine. As well as the Charter Renewal and the Annual Report, you'll be aware that there's a wider inquiry that we're conducting which started a couple of weeks ago. We've already heard from the views of academics, from news and journalism, production and skills and from Ofcom, but from a BBC perspective, how would you describe the current state of broadcasting in Scotland?
Well, as I say, I think the sector is in really good shape. I think that we are investing, particularly from a BBC perspective, more and more money in Scotland. And I think that our challenge is to keep that going. Our challenge is to make sure that we are serving audiences wherever and whenever they want us to. Our challenge is to make sure we're covering the whole of the geography of Scotland. And all of our audiences, as I say, some audiences are very loyal to our linear services. Our television, our radio, our online services are in good health. But we need to go further than that because we know that audiences are receiving content in lots of other places too. And I think it's important that we think about all of our audiences and the way that we serve them. I think that, as I've said, the change in the market is that we are making content which is in competition with the very, very deep-pocketed streamers, but is also distinctive from it. We are all about serving Scotland and making it feel that it is reflected, portrayed, respected by our content. And we do that in more volume than anybody else.
I suppose on that point that you highlighted around making sure that you cover all areas and all demographics, one of the issues that has come up a number of times has been, as we move towards perhaps new ways of delivering content, that we're careful that we don't perhaps remove some of the more traditional ways that certain demographics are very reliant on, older people, some of the regions. How are you ensuring that you don't leave certain groups behind?
Yeah, well, in terms of the geography, I think we have more bases than any other broadcaster or media organisation in Scotland. We have 14 bases, 12 of which do news. We have, as you know, several opt-outs across the country where we do specific content for those areas. I mean, I would point you to the recent coverage of the severe weather in the first week of the year, and I have probably never been more proud of my journalists, particularly in the North East, in the Highlands, in Orkney and Shetland, and the way in which, while half the country looked out of their window and said, my drive's blocked and my kids haven't got a school to go to, our journalists went out there and covered that story in really, really difficult conditions, and will continue to do so. And in terms of that linear piece, it is a challenge. We are trying to ride two horses at the moment. We are trying to push into the areas where we know that potentially younger audiences are going to receive their news content and their general content, while serving audiences that are still very loyal to our linear services. What we do now, and Louise might talk about this a bit more later, but we don't commission for a specific channel terribly often. I mean, it's slightly different in terms of our continuous services, but we commission content and we place it in lots of different places. And while, at the beginning of my career, we worked in specific areas, so I started in radio and moved into television, we're now asking our journalists and our content makers to make a piece of content for a number of different outlets, and that increases and increases. And, how we pivot between the way in which we tell stories for slightly different audiences that we know are in different places, while maintaining television, radio, online, really firm services for those people. But, for example, you may have seen that we have recently started badging our content in Scotland for the first time, I think, with Scottish Budget, with Verify. We now have the Verify badge in Scotland. We delivered for our live page, huge numbers for our live page that day, some Verify content. We've made digital videos with Verify badging on it. So those audiences that perhaps aren't coming to television and radio, which still got, live coverage of the budget, extensive coverage across our television services, extensive coverage across radio that day and the following day, we are moving into other areas at the same time to make sure, if that's not where you go, you still get the benefit of our coverage of those big events.
And just on the part of your question that's around the technologies and making sure that all audiences can access public service content, obviously the future of things like Freeview is a matter for the UK government, not for the broadcasters, but the BBC wouldn't envisage any scenario where people were left behind. We already have a history, for example, of moving the audience in Scotland from analogue transmission to digital, and now obviously all of Freeview is via digital transmission, and the whole ethos of that bit of work in Scotland in 2010 and 2011 was to make sure there was help there for people, to make sure no one was left behind. If you're a universal public broadcaster, you do need everyone to have access to those services.
I think it's an important point, and you highlighted the situation with the bad weather recently. I was in Orkney. I looked out the drive and I couldn't see it. And it highlighted, I think, the importance of local radio, particularly to be able to keep people updated of what was going on, school closures, road closures, but also the kind of people that are perhaps listening are those who've always listened, that will always get up to listen to the morning broadcasting. If I can of course.
We obviously serve the whole of Scotland. That story was, obviously far more prevalent in the north of Scotland, and I think it shows our commitment. Occasionally the media in Scotland is accused of being central belt centric, and we absolutely weren't on that, and we achieved huge numbers. And we know it's a story that's of interest, whether you can't see your driveway or whether you sitting in Glasgow thinking, this feels very different. We did one thing which I thought was genius, which was instead of what's on, I think in Orkney and Shetland, we did what's off. And those services were absolutely committed to keeping doing those.
Yes, I mean, I had friends of mine who were in Glasgow telling me how much they wished they had the snow while we were sitting in the snow wishing we hadn't. So if I can move on to a second question before I bring our colleagues in. One of our academic witnesses told us, I'm going to quote this, BBC Scotland could do more and be more ambitious, and that it should have a greater budget to do that. It should be a sector leader on skills and development, and it should be a catalyst for the whole media ecosystem. My worry is that at the moment, BBC Scotland is in many ways too insular and does not have enough relationships and activities with other stakeholders in the media ecosystem. Ms. Valentine, if I can ask you and perhaps colleagues, what your response is to Professor Beveridge's critique?
The BBC and the way it's operated in Scotland has changed massively, as I mentioned at the beginning of this recently. And we have never had more partnerships. We have never looked more broadly. And I think we absolutely should be a catalyst for those things that you talked about. I would argue that we are. I mean, I am super ambitious for our content, both in terms of the what you might call ambitious risk-taking editorial decisions, but also, just expanding what we do, expanding the number of dramas that we make, expanding where we are in comedy and entertainment and factual programme and in our news. I'll get Louise to come in a second because she deals with a lot of different people, but we are constantly looking for external partners. I mean, frankly, it's not easy to make those big pieces of content, the expensive drama that we are going into without external partners, and we are constantly looking for external partnerships, across the country and across the world. As you'll have seen in the announcements we made last year around our drama strategy, there's far more co-commissioning so that we can attract those bigger budgets from other parts of the BBC, as you know, from network television, from network BBC, but much more broadly from the industry as well, in order that we do that. And you can look at some recent examples. I mean, our Gaelic services have moved into high-impact drama because they have been ambitious for the ability to attract a variety of different funding partners in order to do that. I'm going to pass to Louise in a second to give you more detail of the sort of partners that we work with on those areas. But on skills and training, again, we are very ambitious. We take our responsibilities in this extremely seriously. And, we work with a range of partners, including Screen Scotland, on all of the products that we make, and with all of the third-party providers that we work with, and all of the production companies, to make sure that training and skills is embedded in this. In addition to this, you probably know, but we have 70-odd apprentices in the BBC at the moment. And we have relationships with every university, I think, in Scotland. We have some formal relationships with, for example, the Conservatoire, but we have informal relationships. I had a look into this after one of your witnesses was talking about our university relationships, and I couldn't find a university in Scotland that we don't have a relationship with. Often, it's some of our senior editorial figures who use what we call development days or their own time to go and work with students on that thing. And the proof is in the pudding that when we hire, I've lists of our recent first hires and apprentices very often come out of those courses. So I think both at the schools, universities and further education level, we have relationships across Scotland which are really beneficial to both sides. We do a lot of work in training and skills in terms of our own apprentices and also the work that we do with the sector when we commission something. And, because we want to, but also because we have to, we work with a huge range of partners. Louise, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Hayley. I think we have never been so outward-looking, and certainly in the time that I've been in commissioning, and that's out of ambition, but it's also out of necessity. If you look at our scripted slate, which, when we started the channel, we built on the success of Guilt. Now we're looking at a raft of dramas and comedies that have international funding. If I look at something like Councils, for example, that is coming later on in the year, we're really excited about it. It's got a number of partners. It's between ourselves, it's between BBC Network, but there's also in co-production with ZDF Neo as well. So these structures need to be put together to get ambitious drama off the ground. We're just about to launch Richard Gadd's new drama, which is called Half Man, and that's coming very soon. We're working with our partners in BBC Content, but also with HBO. Our comedy, Dinosaur, which is coming back for a second series. We work in partnership with Hulu, so a brilliant Glasgow-based comedy goes out, the other side of the Atlantic. We really are building partnerships constantly, and BBC Scotland certainly is out there and having all these international meetings. Just before Christmas we had a really successful drama called The Ridge. That was our own commission, so we didn't work with Network on that drama, but we worked with Sky New Zealand, which was a new partnership for us, which was built up through lots of collaboration, and you can imagine the conversations 8 o'clock in the morning versus 8 o'clock at night to manage that time difference.
Comment on that, because I think those are important, obviously, to hear those kind of international relationships. What about the landscape within Scotland? I mean, is there enough opportunities within Scotland for either more commissioning or more partnerships there? Do you find that the Scottish broadcasting scene is too small, or is essentially have you maxed it out in terms of those relationships you have with them already?
I think the sector is really ambitious. Certainly when I go to some of these international events, there is a lot of representation from both Screen Scotland and also Scottish production companies. And there are Scottish production companies that are making work all across the world. So, you know, I think the opportunity is there. I think the ambition is there. And I think we've got some brilliant production companies who know how to put together these deals. And there's an increasing number of them. So, you know, I feel really positive about the direction of travel. Certainly within sort of drama. Comedy is slightly harder to build international co-productions roundabout, just because of the cultural sensibilities roundabout comedy and where it travels. But that's why I'm so excited about something like Dinosaur, which has done so well, coming back second series. We've got a really strong relationship with Hulu. So I think everything is sort of, you know, we've made a lot of progress over the past sort of 5 years, I would say, and we're in a good position.
And we do have a number of Scotland-wide partnerships with other organisations, those that themselves have a Scotland-wide portfolio, the most obvious being MG Alba, with whom, of course, we make BBC Alba, but with partnerships with the National Library of Scotland, as Hayley Valentine mentioned, with the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, because it's the only institution of that kind, with the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities, which is for us, very helpful umbrella body, bringing together Scotland's academic institutions with people who want to research in the space of sort of culture, the arts. We have the National Film and Television School, Scottish Libraries Information Council, Scottish Book Trust. There are a range of Scotland-wide bodies with whom we think it's really vital that we work, and those are not just ad hoc, we have formal partnerships with them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in colleagues now, Stephen Kerr and any other colleagues who'd like to come in.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I was interested in, Hayley Valentine, your comments about BBC Scotland's outreach to universities and colleges, because you rightly picked up on some of the evidence we received, I think it was last week, about that. But even the way you described it, forgive me, it doesn't sound very structured. Is it as structured as it should be?
I mean, it is, you know, a kind of, you know, it is ad hoc. You know,
Yeah.
we have relationships that are based on, you know, the skill set that those universities are seeking and individuals within the BBC. If I'm honest, I can't imagine that it would be better if it was structured. You know, if we mandated that this number of days, this number, whatever, what we have is different levels of expertise. So, for example, we've got one of our excellent development producers who spends time working on pitches in a university with people. We have members of a disclosure team who go out to Stirling to talk to them about investigative journalism. So, it is, from what I can see, and as I say, I asked this question because I heard the evidence, and I actually was surprised at how much came back. If I'd come back and said, you know, it was sketchy, there were only a few universities that were benefiting from it, I might be sitting here saying, you know, I think actually we should set up something that's a bit more structured. I think it is working brilliantly. I think we've got everything from, as I say, people who have that kind of development experience, you know, pushing out how do you put a pitch together. We have, you know, senior figures in news going out to news journalism courses. We've had our head of politics out at universities. We've had our head of programmes in news. We've had our head of sport out
Are they
in
doing
news.
that in, you said in your previous comments, they were doing that pretty much in their own time.
Yeah, we have something called development days at the BBC. It's 3 days a year that we offer people that is, you know, part of their structure, so they can go out and do it in that time. I mean, you know, people do it, you know, while they're on shift. We're not asking them to do it at the weekends.
Just wonder if that's great that those individuals do that, but I'm just wondering whether the BBC ought not to have a more upfront profile in these institutions. These people do, and I accept what you're saying about, you know, what they're doing when they go out on their development days. But shouldn't the BBC itself plant a flag in the universities and colleges, given the fact that that brand with young people is under a bit of pressure, to put it mildly?
Yeah, I mean, if I thought there was a lack, then I would be thinking about a different way of covering this. What I found when I knew about some of this already, and I think, you know, in particular, I think one of the witnesses was from University of West of Scotland. We have a huge relationship with them. We have, you know, I say a number of the people that I've mentioned have been out to the University of West of Scotland to talk to, you know, journalism students and sports students in particular. You know, one of our regular output editors of our Drive Time programme on radio is a former student of UWS, who we have brought in and you know, worked with, and she's now in a senior position. We have, you know, several apprentices who've come from UWS. So I think the relationships are working. And
so
particularly there, I don't know if you remember a journalist called Nick Sheridan, who sadly died a few years ago, very young. I was part of the team that hired Nick Sheridan into the BBC from STV when we launched the channel. And we set up a bursary in Nick's name when he died, alongside STV and UWS. So that particular kind of portrayal of the lack of relationship, I just didn't recognise. If I thought there was an issue, I would be trying to solve it. What I found is that we do more than even I expected. It's working very effectively. It's quite tailored. If anything falls off, then we might think differently. And if anyone is, sitting in a university saying, I'd like more contact from the BBC, they're very free to ask, and we will always say yes.
Well, okay, well, that's positive. Obviously been well briefed on the evidence that we've had over the last couple of weeks, particularly when the BBC has obviously heavily featured. You said a few minutes ago that the ecosystem, the Scottish broadcast ecosystem, is in good health. That isn't what we heard from those witnesses, as I'm sure you will be aware, specifically in the area of commissioning. Because last year you came and you told us that we have 14... The quote you gave us was, we have 14 commissioners based in Scotland. That's a combination of commissioners who work directly for me, commissioners who work for the network looking for Scottish ideas that we can co-commission together, such as Shetland commissioners who work for our Gaelic services. But Screen Scotland, in their evidence, in their published research, said the decrease in commissioning activity from PSBs, particularly the BBC's reduction in originated hours and Channel 4's recent commissioning freeze, is coming together with a wider industry trend of polarisation in content spend, where content commissioners reprioritize spend to fewer high-value originations, plus lower budget content. That does square with what you said this morning, because you've put, every one of you that's spoken about commissioning has spoken about, I think ambition has become a code word for big, one might be forgiven for saying big and beautiful productions. But that is having, according to the evidence we've heard, that's having a really adverse effect on the small independent production or content creation sector. Do you recognise that as a reality? And I'm juxtapositioning that with your comment about ecosystem is in good health, because clearly at some parts of the ecosystem it's not in very good health.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt we're in a period of change, and that we can see that in audience habits, and the sector is changing to reflect that. And that's correct. We, as an industry, we are commissioning fewer hours. We've got inflationary pressures, we've got pressures on budget, but not just that. We need big hits, to bring people together, and as the BBC...
You're in competition with these streamers,
We're in competition with streamers, we're in competition with, digital platforms, gaming. We all know what the picture's like, it's very competitive.
But what the other point of view says is, actually the BBC shouldn't be in competition with any of these. The BBC has a particularly distinctive role to play within the ecosystem, and it shouldn't see itself as in competition with Netflix.
Well, we're in competition because we want people to want to pay the licence fee. People need to see value in the BBC, so we need to make content that they value.
Right.
I mean, it's great that Traitors is the biggest show in the nation at the moment, where that's fantastic, and it's a great story for how, when we get it right, we can get broad audiences, underserved audiences, young audiences, and actually to kind of watch on a schedule as well. It's sort of doing quite an amazing job there. But in my job, I'm looking for those hits from Scotland, and I want to be commissioning, our industry to make those big shows as well. It's not the only game in town, the kind of big hits. You're right. We have lots of shows that we commission because we think they're serving a particular purpose, or they're going to hit a particular audience. And we will continue to do that. We're not commercial. We are a PSB.
But what the small independents say is, and you actually said this in what you said a few minutes ago, you said about how you go around the world because of your role and you meet Scottish independent producers on big stages. Mm-hmm. But what they say to us is, but our work doesn't get broadcast on the BBC.
I think a lot of their work does.
Right, so you would contest that.
9 out of 10 companies I work with are in Scotland. So I would say, what I would say is, there's no doubt the market's changing. Some of the I would say the middle is being squeezed, and we had quite a heritage in Scotland of making lots of unscripted sort of middle tariff shows. there's no doubt that we're commissioning fewer of those shows,
Right.
responding to audience taste, because we want to commission premium, high-value shows. But shows, for example, like if I take Highland Cops as an example, there's a brilliant factual show that gets a big audience on linear, does really well on iPlayer, does really well with a whole raft of audiences. Those are the kind of shows that we want to commission. They absolutely get us around Scotland. They're made in Scotland by Scottish producers. What we're seeing is there are just fewer of the kind of like more lower cost unscripted shows. We're not making so many of them anymore because we need to invest in drama, we need to invest in comedy, and we need to invest in premium factual as well.
Can I add into
yes,
that? The question about what is the BBC's role that's different from the streamers. I mean, for me, it's two things. One is that we need to reflect the lives of people in Scotland in a way that the streamers may come in and make one show a year. We know that Department Q was a big success last year, and I'm delighted about that. I don't want to be the only person making content in and about Scotland, but we need to be in that game making a volume of shows where people feel that their lives are reflected in Scotland, and that's one of the things that we do. The other thing is that we can't be the broadcaster of market failure. We need to make these big hits. We need to make successful things to bring people to the BBC for all the stuff that we do. So, we wouldn't, if this was the only thing that we did, we wouldn't be investing in Disclosure, we wouldn't be investing in Debate Night, those kind of shows that, are high investment, high amount of, money and time taken. I mean, Disclosure, months and months spent on individual, very, very valuable journalism to us. What I really want to do is bring people to the BBC for, whatever thing that they come for. They may not come for the news and current affairs, they may not come for the religious programme, but they will stay for it. And, we this time last year I wasn't able to talk to you in huge amounts of detail about the football, but we obviously now have the internationals. And what we've seen is that people who, we call them laps, so people who maybe haven't come to the BBC on iPlayer for maybe, 3 months, who came in for the football, a big chunk of them, I think a quarter of them, within a fortnight came back for something else. So part of my strategy is that you will bring people in for those big hitting dramas. We'd hope they'd come for a new Richard Gadd drama or a new legal drama, and they will see what else is available on the BBC when they're there and realise that actually it's worth their time.
Well, it's interesting to hear you describe your strategy. And for being as transparent, I'm grateful for being as transparent. You mentioned the TV licence. We have discussed this before, and I don't want to go over all ground. But clearly there is a fall-off in the number of people across the UK. We don't have statistics for Scotland that I'm aware of, but we know across the UK there is a problem with the percentage of the population using BBC content but not paying the BBC licence fee. And it would appear, from my own anecdotal experience as well, to be younger audiences who don't seem to value the BBC sufficiently to wish to pay the BBC TV licence. What does your own research tell you about younger people's attitudes towards the whole idea of a kind of a universal TV tax to allow them to watch the BBC without fear of criminal prosecution?
We know the vast majority of people in Scotland are licensed as they should be, and that is a fact. The vast bulk of people who require a licence.
But there's a growing minority.
We also know that, you may remember a few years ago, it was entirely legal to watch the iPlayer without a TV licence.
Yeah.
And then the UK Parliament changed the law. When you log into iPlayer, it says, you need a TV licence. Do you have one?
Yeah.
And at the point at which we put that message in, people clicked through and bought one. So most people yes, there was a spike in licence fee sales at the point at which it became a legal requirement to watch the iPlayer with a licence.
I don't think I've ever heard that before.
So people generally want to operate within the law, but
they do, absolutely do. But
there is a cost of living crisis, and we're completely aware of that. And I think it is utterly vital, if people believe in public service broadcasting, if you believe that broadcasting is a public service, that we need reform of our funding. The BBC is really clear that we need reform of how we are funded. At the moment, there is...
Including the model, potentially.
Potentially
the Green Paper... does suggest.
Well, the Green Paper is from the UK government. That is a range of options. They do talk about reform of the licence fee, and there are ways you could reform it. There are other funding models, some of which we, as a broadcaster, have ruled out. So we don't support advertising, partly because of the impact that would have on the sector that you've discussed.
Well, there's already sponsorship on the BBC. I mean, I love the New Year's Day concert in Vienna. It's sponsored by Rolex, and it's regularly mentioned in the bits between the music that is sponsored by Rolex.
Well, I'm sure the Vienna Symphony Orchestra benefits a lot from exactly that. But we don't support advertising on our services, and also we don't believe in subscription. I think your question was around young people and their experiences.
Well, I want to know what the BBC's own research says about what under-35s think about the BBC TV licence.
So we know that under-35s use the BBC a lot. I think your question is, how do you get to a model?
No, my question is, what research has the BBC done about the attitudes?
Well, I'll come back to the fact that the majority of people are legally licensed.
No, that doesn't...
So I think we recognise the need for reform, and that's for all audiences.
Right,
we recognise
you've
that
not done any
reform.
research.
Of course we talk to our audience all the time, but there's an active consultation at the moment with people around Scotland.
This is not a difficult question.
I'm not going to lead the witness, but we don't think that subscription is the way ahead, precisely because it puts a barrier between us and young people, or us and the rest of our audiences. And we notice the UK government has said that direct taxation is not an option either. So I think, don't get me wrong, I think we absolutely recognise the need for reform, but right now I wouldn't say where that should go, because there is an active consultation.
Yes, but ruling out different ways of funding the BBC
well, I think because one damages the sector potentially, and the other one puts your public content behind a wall. And if you're a universal service, you shouldn't be behind a wall.
That's a subjective point of view. I wonder if I can ask Hayley Valentine what research the BBC's done about what are the attitudes of under-35s about the BBC TV licence.
Mr. Kerr, this is going to have to be your last question.
Oh, is it?
And then we'll try, if there's time, to bring you back.
Okay, forget that question. If this is my last question, let me ask Hayley Valentine. I'm being guillotined here. Not for the first time. Asking Hayley Valentine about the issue of autonomy and decision-making and trust, because that comes up as a theme, and I've no doubt will come up later on. But a number of people in the evidence sessions we've had so far, witnesses, have said the BBC is constrained in editorial terms by controls from London. I'd like you to comment on that. And then the other issue is the issue of a trust deficit in the BBC brand in Scotland. It's more pronounced, perhaps, is the allegation or the statement is it's more distinct in terms of a trust deficit in Scotland because of the political environment of Scotland. Can you just comment on both of those issues? And I'm sure colleagues will wish to ask you more questions about it.
I mean, I'll be brief if I can.
Please don't be brief, because that only feeds into the...
If you can just give a fulsome answer, and Mr. Kerr will let you answer.
I'll be brief.
Okay. On the first point, I just don't recognise the idea that we are... I can't remember quite the words used, but stymied from London.
Yeah, constrained.
Controlled or constrained from London. I mean, I just have no evidence of it at all. We run our own newsroom. I don't receive instructions from anyone on how to run that newsroom. We report, as you know, without fear or favour. We cover some exceptionally difficult stories. We take some big editorial risks. We run, a lot of live output. We're the only nation that has a regular debate night programme. We really hold these things dear. And as I say, I can't talk positively enough about our disclosure brand and the work that we do there, which is, it's not just about, impactful television or impactful journalism. It makes proper change in this country, and I think the evidence is in what we do. Apologies, the second half of the question was around...
The trust deficit. The idea that there's a distinctly Scottish dimension to the fact that people do not trust the BBC. Basically, the suggestion is on the basis of the political environment in Scotland. Just to start with the trust issue as a whole, the BBC, there is a decline in trust in mainstream media overall. This is true across the world. We know, broadly speaking, why that is. The BBC remains, incredibly highly trusted in comparison with other institutions in this country and abroad. Our news is the most trusted in the world. I'm very proud of things like the World Service, which, as you know, I used to work on. And
I think we can overplay the issue of trust. The other thing is, people consume us in huge numbers. I mean, in Scotland, I think, 83% of the country consumes the BBC every week. That number goes up to 90-odd% every month. There's a sort of, when people are asked which broadcaster they trust the most, we come out, we get almost kind of 50% of the total. The next best we're on kind of 50% trust us the most. The next best is something like 6%. So I think we can overplay the trust issue. I'm not going to pretend that we don't live in a polarised society where trust in mainstream media as a whole is on the decline, and we have to work incredibly hard on that. I'm pretty optimistic, and I said this last year, and as we go into an election, I'll say it again, the trust scores for Scotland in particular between the two last general elections went up. According to Ofcom, the way that the country views us is pretty stable in terms of reliability and trust scores. We're not on massive decline on this. It's in the margins. That is not to deny the culture that we live in. I live with a fairly hostile media and whatever all the time in Scotland, and there are various divisive issues that we could all talk about, at length, and probably shouldn't today. But I don't deny that Scotland has its particular issues. But I would say that in that context, the BBC is holding up really strongly on trust, and deservedly so.
Thank you. I think I've run out of time.
You have. I've been very generous given your excellent timekeeping, Mr Kerr. If I can move on to Keith Brown.
Thanks very much. Just to say that I think at the start, as we're saying, that I'm a big supporter of the BBC. That may come as a surprise to some people, and a supporter of a licence fee. However, we do see, whether it's through the charter process or other interference from government, and of course broadcasting remains reserved. And we had Tim Davie tell us fairly recently, or tell my group, that every week he had 4 or 5 visits from each of the two main parties, people beating a path to his door to complain about something or other. Scotland doesn't really feature in that, I don't think. I think there's sometimes a feeling that the BBC is impervious to demands in Scotland for more balanced reporting. I should also say that one of our previous witnesses said that they had heard, I forget how they quoted the evidence, that there seemed to be a move amongst younger people in particular to go back to things like the BBC or teachers or parents, things which you see as being more stable and more reliable, rightly or wrongly, because of the, if you like, the whirlpool and diversity of the media that they can actually consume. So there's a chance here for the BBC to really build on that, and I think through the licence fee. But if I can come back to the point about current affairs, and apologies to the committee members who have mentioned this before, the BBC in Scotland seems to have a pathological objection to covering reserved issues which impact on Scotland. So an example would be you have done, I don't know how many, investigative programmes into the ferries situation, legitimate news, fair enough. I don't think there was anything done by the BBC in Scotland on the aircraft carriers, which were massively over budget, massively over time, were built in Scotland, had a major impact on the Scottish taxpayer. But there seems to be this news blackout that comes with things like that. And similarly, I've challenged in the past both Martin Geisler and, going back in time, Gordon Brewer as to why there was not much more scrutiny of what were told of the two governments in Scotland. And both told me that they couldn't get UK representatives to come on the show, which is not a reason not to cover these issues. So I think that is an issue of balance that's there, and it seems to be part of a kind of deferential approach which the BBC have got in Scotland to the UK. It'd be interesting to hear comments on that. And also, just to live in a kind of counterfactual universe for a minute, how do you think, or do you think at all, the BBC in Scotland would be different had broadcasting been devolved back in 1999?
Interesting last question, but I'll come to the first point first. I hadn't let me think about that. Just on Tim Davie and politicians, I mean, a couple of things. That Tim Davie's door, as far as I understand it, and I don't want to speak for him, but is open to all politicians all of the time. We know that he has regular contact from Scottish politicians. And, if I've met all of the party leaders, I think, at least once, if not more than once, and there's not a meeting that I have turned down. If you want to come and talk to me about something, whether it's your perception or what other people are telling you about the BBC, my door is open. You know, I've met a number of you one-to-one, and I'm happy to do that whenever possible. You know, I will absolutely make the time for it. It's very important to me, particularly at the moment, because we do want your support as we head towards Charter. So you know, that's that. On the reserved issues issue, I think that, you know, obviously Gordon Brew was a while ago. I think that things are very different now. You know, I mean, since we have launched our new breakfast programme, which obviously Martin presents, we have had the Secretary of State on a number of times. We have had Rachel Reeves on the programme. We've had Kirsty McNeill on the programme. We've had Michael Shanks on the programme. It is different. There is not a pushback of politicians. We bid for politicians all the time, as you know. It's a big part of the programme's remit. We are clearly, you know, our remit is to cover the stories which are having the biggest impact on our audience here in Scotland, particularly in our radio services. You know, the distinctiveness of Radio Scotland is absolutely about serving audiences in Scotland. So, you know, I'd have to look at the ferries issue in terms of, you know, specific stories and the aircraft carriers. But the ferries is a massive story for our audience. You know, it is literally a lifeline for our audience. You know, we know that they use the ferries on a regular basis, and for some people, as I say, everything from getting to work to getting to the doctors or whatever it might be. So it's really important to us. The aircraft carriers, I know, has been covered across Network News, which clearly is obviously available in Scotland as well. I'd have to look at the specifics of the issues, and I can come back to you on that. But broadly speaking, our responsibility, particularly on programmes which are serving Scotland, in particular with our news content, is to look at issues that we know that our audience wants us to cover. And, you know, we're really working in that area. Heading into the election, for example, we'll be using the Your Voice brand, which is, you know, a way in which our audience can get in touch with us to cover the stories that they want us to cover that we may not know about. You know, we've done things so far about, you know, from bus fares to a retiring ballet teacher in Edinburgh. You know, we do a huge range of stories that we might not necessarily know about, that audience brings to us. So that is what we try to deliver on a daily basis. But we absolutely, and I'd say particularly, you know, recently, have had a lot of politicians that are part of the UK government, not just part of the Scottish government. So I think that has changed. I think Martin, if you asked him, would tell you that has changed as well. The last thing about broadcasting, had it been devolved, I mean, I'm sorry, it's kind of a hypothetical, and I don't know what the difference would be. I don't know what the difference would be. I feel that we are doing a job for the people of Scotland. The industry, as I say, has changed massively, and we have tried to move with it. It is our job to keep up, in my view. It's our job to make sure that we're serving all of our audiences. And, you know, I talk to the Cabinet Secretary for Culture on a regular basis. I talk to a number of people around this room on a regular basis. I don't think that my role or the way that I carried it out would be any different.
And I think it's important that the audience has told us that they want us to be independent of governments, plural. And what they also told us in Scotland, that was more important than in other parts of the UK in the survey that we did last year. But I think whether it's reserved or whether it's devolved is literally a matter for parliaments and governments. The BBC will obviously operate within the broadcasting environment in which it finds itself. But we made an agreement with this Parliament and with the Senate in Wales about 10 years ago that we do lay our annual report and accounts at the Scottish Parliament and at the Senate, despite the fact that broadcasting is reserved, that BBC witnesses come. We are scrutinised at this committee, quite rightly, and indeed work with the committee across the wider culture brief, which I think we would do whether or not broadcasting was devolved or reserved. I think there are ongoing relations. In fact, the Director General, who you mentioned, was here last year, is at the Senate today in Wales giving evidence there. So I think there are ongoing amounts of dialogue, and I'm sure that would continue on either side of that coin.
If I could just come in on that one, just worth reflecting on the question that the economies of scale that come with having the operating model as it stands and how we get our content to our audiences, content audiences in Scotland, the economies of scale around our technology, our distribution, and also the content that's provided to audiences in Scotland that may be for the whole of the UK, but Scottish audiences also benefiting from that.
Yeah, I have to say I'm less than convinced about, I wouldn't even really say it was an answer as to why the BBC in Scotland would feel it wasn't important to cover the aircraft carriers situation. They were built in Scotland. The cost overruns were huge. The fact that they didn't actually work very well as well, you'd have thought would be an issue. And I suppose we'll have to differ. I think it would be a very different BBC had broadcasting been devolved. Now, it may well be the case, and I very much hope that it is, that we face a referendum on independence once again, depending on the outcome of elections and so on. That being the case, how confident would you be that we won't see a rerun of what we saw in 2014, which was the importation of journalists en masse, not just the BBC, and some of them Scottish journalists, but who had not been based in Scotland for a long time, just basically taking over the coverage of that? Do you think you're in a better place to resist that just now, or would you want to resist it?
I mean, as you know, or some of you know, worked on the referendum campaign in Scotland with Scottish journalists and Scottish presenters who are based here and continue to work for the BBC. So I think that the representation of it all being people being what we used to call helicoptered in is not a fair representation of the whole campaign. However, bearing that in mind, I do think that there's been a huge amount of change since 2014. That some of the people who will be voting in this election coming up were, in primary school at that stage, and life has moved on massively since then, not least in the way that the BBC operates. So, for example, for the election coming up, we are working closely with our network colleagues. They are not working separately from us. We have steering groups that are led by nations. Obviously, there's a Welsh election as well, that are led by nations to which network colleagues attend. And we make shared decisions about coverage and about what our ambitions and plans are for those elections. There are also clearly, because network news is a large beast, there are network news meetings going on at which there is huge representation from a nations and from a Scotland level. It works in both directions. So the way in which we operate has completely changed in the last 15 years, not necessarily because of the referendum, for a number of reasons: better collaboration, better pool of resources, better understanding of how the nations work within the network news framework. But you will also see that a number of things have changed in Scotland since then. We appointed a Scotland editor, now James Cook, who I worked with during the referendum, again was based in Scotland at that stage and is based in Scotland now, who will lead our coverage of that alongside our political colleagues who work in this building. And I feel like there has definitely been a shift in the way in which we operate, that we will lead things from here, that the editorial will be absolutely led from Scotland by myself and my head of news. And the relationships that we have with Network are much, much closer than they were 11 years ago. And the quality of journalists we have here means that everyone is confident that that would be led from here. If you look just at the way that we covered the general election last year, I know that we're not quite into election campaigning mode for this year, but we do have a track record where we are using increasingly journalists based wherever they are in the whole of the UK. I was in the last election working in local media at BBC in England, and network news programmes, including the 6 and 10 o'clock news, on a nightly basis to use the local political reporters from the region that they were reporting from, because they are absolutely the experts in their field. The level of detail that they could go into on a story, which has presumably been rumbling for months and years, and they've been covering it for their local area for that length of time, is far superior to anybody who could come up on the train for the day and report on a story. That is not to say that this is, this election, and should there be another referendum, they will be huge stories. And as you say, it's not just the BBC. We'd expect, international media of all descriptions to come to Scotland to cover that. And for this election coming, I know you're specifically asking about the referendum, but of course we would expect journalists from across the UK to be coming to Scotland to cover what is a really big story. I don't think you'd argue against that. But in terms of the editorial lead on the story, it will come from here.
Yeah, I think our experiences of the referendum were probably quite different. I spent the last 10 hours of that campaign in the BBC studios. I was interviewed a number of times by journalists from the BBC from out with Scotland. Leaving that aside, my last question, very briefly, is: was an excellent programme on BBC 4 this week about John Logie Baird, which I learned a great deal from. But it just struck me as why would that come from BBC 4? And given the impact both on the BBC and on society of John Logie Baird's invention, and actually one of his inventions still to come, which is 3D TV. And similarly with Alexander Graham Bell, why is BBC Scotland not in the forefront of talking about the way in which these two inventors have changed the face of society much more? And why would it have to be BBC 4 that would cover this rather than... Is it not a perfect opportunity for BBC Scotland to have covered something like that?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to come in on this?
Sure, yeah. BBC4 obviously has a remit to cover the whole of the UK, and that includes Scotland, so they're absolutely within their rights, and they should be showing programmes like that. Our scheduling teams work really closely together, so what we try and do is when we have programmes that we think will work for Scotland, we sometimes do deals together to try and share broadcast packages. So that's how we would work together. So you may see that programme coming on BBC Scotland, but we would work with our network partners to make sure that we plan, you know, the outings of our programmes. Like, for example, our Burns programme, we work very closely with BBC4 and what they're doing with their Burns output as well. So we're all trying to kind of make sure we get the best programmes in the right place.
And I think, as I said earlier, and Louise might have said it too, I can't remember, that we don't commission for channels anymore. We commission for genres. We commission factual, or we commission entertainment, or we commission drama, or we commission news. And we look at where those programmes will sit, and often it's in multiple places.
It just seems a very rich opportunity you've got on the factual programming to cover some of the stuff which is native and unique to Scotland, such as inventing televisions and telephones. But I'll leave it at that. Could be another time's pressing.
Thanks very much. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Can I address governance first of all? Some of the evidence that we've heard makes a strong case for a more decentralised model. And to pick up on one of Hayley Valentine's comments earlier, I don't think the people who've made that case are bringing us specific instances where they think BBC in London has picked up the phone and told you make an editorial decision differently. I don't think they suggest that it's that level or that nature of control, but they do make the case that BBC Scotland would be stronger and better able to serve its specific audience with a more decentralised structure. And I don't think it's just individuals either. Even Screen Scotland, you're hardly likely to indulge a kind of conspiracist mindset on this, have made a case for stronger, effective governance involving the nations and, specifically Scotland, but the nations and regions throughout the UK, a more decentralised approach. I don't imagine BBC Scotland is going to sit here and advocate for one particular model to come out of the Charter review, but have you looked at what the potential options might be if this committee or the UK government was to decide Charter renewal is going to involve some degree of greater decentralisation? What would work and what wouldn't? Are there models that you've considered that would be more or less effective than others?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to speak briefly, but I'll hand to Luke on this, if that's okay, because he looks more at governance issues as his day job than I do. I mean, the governance structure at the moment, I mean, as you know, the BBC's gone through various governance structures, and it's, it is up for debate, absolutely, and it's up for change, absolutely. For me, it works really well. I have worked with two non-executive directors. As I say, I spent a year in BBC Local, and I now obviously lead Scotland. And having a non-executive director in both instances has been, a support where I needed it. They haven't got editorially involved. They haven't done anything that made me feel uncomfortable. We have our Director of Nations who sits on the BBC Executive Committee, and we have strong representation through that. I think we work well as more than the sum of our parts. So in terms of the way it works for me at the moment, I am not desperate for change, because what happens at the moment on a personal level, works well for me at both levels. But Luke, do you want to come in on the kind of broader conversations that are going on?
I think that's right. There is, as Patrick Harvey has said, an active question around the governance of the BBC in the UK government's Green Paper. I think the UK government itself probably favours some models over others. And obviously, again, I would, as you said in your question, be slightly cautious of advocating for one over another. But I recognise it's a live discussion. The BBC does have experience of different governing models, from having had governors at one point and then had the BBC Trust. Now we're independently regulated by Ofcom, and we have direct relationships in Scotland with the regulator. We talk regularly to Ofcom Scotland. We talk regularly with Screen Scotland. A lot of the ways we operate are as the public broadcaster of Scotland. I'm not entirely sure what would change if some of that changed. On a day-to-day basis, I'm not clear what it is that people are seeing isn't happening now that would happen in the future. So I think it's a conversation worth having, but I'm not sure I see a completely pressing need for change.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the issues being considered at UK level is around politicisation of appointments and so on, and I'd be quite open. I hope that politically appointed individuals are removed and that we don't have a process like that in future. But I think the point about decentralisation is slightly separate from that, and I think, you know, if there was to be a move in the direction of some form of greater decentralisation, I'd be a little surprised if BBC Scotland didn't have a view about how that could be made to work. What would be a successful model of delivering that, as opposed to an unsuccessful one?
I think it's important we hear the voices of the audience in Scotland, but we do a lot of that anyway. We have a lot of virtual sessions where we literally hear what people in Scotland think about our output, what they think we should be doing, what they think we shouldn't be doing, in the model that we have at the moment. I'm not sure what bit that's centralised people would like decentralised.
Okay.
Of your 3 people here based in Scotland, none of us report to anybody in London. There's a kind of view of what the model is versus the reality. Maybe we need to get better at explaining that.
I don't want to devalue listening to the audience, but the audience will be focused on what they see and hear and consume, the output, rather than what they know about the structure. Let me turn to quotas. DCMS has said it's open to some variation or change in terms of quotas of production. Have you looked at what would serve the interests of the Scottish broadcasting sector and the Scottish production sector more effectively? I think there's been some long-standing criticisms, but and I think from the evidence that we've heard, a general desire for change, but not necessarily alighting on a single model of how that would work. The issue of how output is designated as Scottish, or how production generally can benefit the wider sector.
I mean, clearly, I hope it comes across. I am incredibly ambitious for BBC Scotland, and we'll make. Louise will tell you as well that we have. We're not short of ideas. Production companies are not short of good ideas that they bring to us. We're not short of really good scripts. We could make more content than we do. Of course, that's true. Within the financial constraints of the BBC, I think we do pretty well. And I think particularly in that model of attracting third-party finance, that's going to really, front-load things in the future. So, the quotas are not set by us. They're set obviously by Ofcom. It's a matter for them if they'd like to change them. What you have seen in the last year is the announcement that, we will, in order to, I think that the phrase is, work more in the spirit of the quotas than the letter of them. We will only by exception have programmes made here which only qualify on one criteria, and we are front-loading the spend criteria so that more money is invested into the Scottish sector. That is our ambition. That's not to say we'll never do anything that only hits one of the quotas as they currently stand. I think at the moment, I think 90% of our programme choices meet at least 2 of the criteria. So it's not that this is going to be a massive change for us, but we will look at it through the lens of by exception only. So that's where we are at the moment. So there was a second part to your question around quotas, wasn't there? I forget what it was.
I don't remember a second part either. I mean, essentially the case is made that there's a degree of need for change, that there are long-standing criticisms, but there doesn't seem to be consensus on a particular variation of change, a particular model of change.
Yeah.
You'd be open to working with a more ambitious set of quotas, if that's what's decided.
Absolutely. If someone decides that that there are a bigger percentage of the BBC budget is spent in Scotland, I will not struggle to spend it. We do beat all of our quotas at the moment. We're not living in a kind of world of minimum. Yeah. We talked last year a little bit about the floor versus the ceiling, and I don't have a ceiling. Yeah. At the moment, I think the quota for.
Is it fair to suggest that if there was to be a more ambitious approach to this, it links back to the earlier question about decentralisation, and BBC Scotland would itself need a bigger budget in order to be able to achieve more? The BBC would need to push spending out.
Yes, I think that the decentralisation we're sort of talking about governance at that stage.
But it has a financial aspect.
Yeah, I would also welcome more senior leaders in Scotland, more commissioning power in Scotland. I mean, we have a lot of successful models, as we've talked to both last year and today around the commissioning model. You know, I think we have a sort of model that others can look to, where we work, particularly there's the example of drama and comedy, where we have Scottish-specific commissioners who work with Louise. We have network commissioners who work to network genres, both sets based in Scotland, working really closely together on projects, working separately in other projects, and it's a really effective model in terms of the direction of travel. I think if we can replicate that more and more and more, I'd be really happy with that, obviously.
Can I
but you're right, it would require more money, and
Yeah. Can I ask you to contrast some of the comments you just made with the pushback that's been received around changes to Radio Scotland's late-night output?
Yes.
You'll be well aware of some of the criticisms. I think the Music Industry Scottish Music Industry Association described the changes as a significant withdrawal of vital support for Scotland's artists, the erosion of a dedicated, culturally rooted space in the schedule where Scottish artists can be discovered, contextualised and championed. And the argument is basically put that this is a shift from what's described as discovery music programming that's going to introduce something new and creative to audiences, the replacement of that with what's described as easy listening. Can you respond to that? And,
yeah, absolutely.
How that relates to your comment about wanting to be ambitious and risk-taking.
And distinctive. And distinctive, actually, is the thing here. So, I'm sorry, this won't be a particularly quick answer. When I took over this job, obviously I look at all of our services, and what I'm looking for is growth. Back to the question about the licence fee, we need to make sure that people are finding content that they find valuable and interesting and worth spending their time with in Scotland. And we know radio, in particular, hadn't changed terribly much in a number of years for very, very good reasons. In that we're in the middle of a digital revolution. We'd launched a television channel, and the radio station had been in a bit of decline. It's not that long ago that Radio Scotland, Scotland's national radio station, had 1 million listeners, and when I took over, it was down at about 800,000. We'd lost about a fifth of our listening. So, I took the view that we needed to do a number of things. It's not a crisis, but we don't wait for things to become a crisis before we change them. But we looked at our breakfast output, and we've made some recent changes to that. We looked at areas where we thought we could bring in new talent, and that's a big part of our strategy. We need to develop people, we need to bring in new talent, and that's not going to happen around, for example, our breakfast show. It's going to happen at other points in the schedule. And finally, we looked at places where, frankly, the audience decline needed to be stopped. We were looking at really small numbers for a couple of our shows, and the late night schedule was not attracting the share of the audience that we would expect it to at that time. Now, this is a share of available audience. Now, I understand, of course, that late night audiences are going to be smaller. So what we did, and in my view, it was a relatively small schedule change. Now, clearly, it's attracted a lot of noise, as every change that we make does. We put the programmes out to tender. We announced new presentation and a new schedule across the week. The other thing that I think is important in radio, and as you know, I brought in a new head of audio and events to look after the radio station, because it was important to me alongside our events criteria, our events schedule. But it is important that we have some kind of coherence across the week. We know that people listen for personality. We know that they listen for the warmth and the energy of a particular presenter. That's kind of it. We haven't changed our music policy at all. And, unfortunately, and I totally understand it, first of all, we're always going to make a small number of people unhappy if we change the schedule, because we don't wait until we have 0 listeners. So we know that some people are unhappy when we make all sorts of changes. We've talked about change in the past at this committee. But there is always, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but there is always a gap between announcing something and it starting. We don't announce on the day that we start programmes. And in that gap, some misinformation grew around our support for the Scottish music sector.
What was that misinformation?
That we are pulling away from the Scottish music sector, that we are not supporting Scottish artists and new artists, and that somehow we're moving to an automated playlist. There are only actually 4 hours of our schedule, which is during the day, 10 till 12 and 1:30 to 3 in the afternoon, where we have a playlist, and it's not made by a machine, it's made by an individual. Our playlist is 3 times as big as our commercial rivals.
Can I just ask you to focus in very specifically, because I know we are tight for time. Are you telling us that as a result of these changes there will be at least the same or more hours of what is called genuinely free-form late-night music discovery? Because this, I appreciate the point about protecting audience numbers and trying to drive those up. That's not the only consideration
No,
here.
absolutely
it's about
not.
giving emerging artists a platform, the opportunity to be found and to be heard.
I am telling you that, yes. I am telling you that. There is no change. I mean, we've done a bit of research of our own, obviously, because it's important to us that we monitor new output, that the number of Scottish artists and the number of new Scottish artists between the last week of the old schedule in December and the first 2 weeks of the new schedule is broadly the same. And I would argue that if you are a Scottish artist, we are looking for growth. Across the piece, we are looking for bigger numbers. We are looking to make more of our audience think that we are worth tuning into, frankly. And in that space, if you are a new or emerging Scottish artist, you will hopefully get a bigger audience. There is limited point in going onto programmes which are in decline if you're not getting a big audience to have that. But I'm absolutely telling you that. Okay. We are not playlisting. We're not reducing the number of Scottish artists. It wouldn't make any sense to us. I mean, we support more specialist music programmes than any other network does. From Travelling Folk to Take the Floor to Pipe. We support a lot of specific specialist Scottish programmes. Our daytime schedule is more mainstream, but still 25% of our music track list at that point in the day is Scottish, and in that late night schedule we'll carry on supporting Scottish artists. That's not the change that we've made.
And if I may, very briefly, I think there's a slight mischaracterisation of what was on air before. I heard the last show of Natasha Raskin-Sharps, for example, just because I was going about my business, and there was Billie Holiday, there was Nina Simone, Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Ramones, a choir from New York. That's not new emerging Scottish talent. And on our new schedule, you've got Roddy Hart, who himself, of course, knows the music scene in Scotland like the back of his hand, presenting 2 new programmes. So there's more Roddy Hart than there was now at the weekend on a Saturday and a Sunday. I think what may have caused some of the confusion is that the procurement exercise, because some of these programmes are made for us by independent producers, they're not made by the BBC. It's quite right that we engage with the independent sector in Scotland. That procurement was for the weekday output. We make the in-house content at the weekend. So we, the BBC, are making Roddy Hart's content. The procurement was for the new programme during the week. So I think that's possibly where some of the confusion has come from.
Okay. Is there time for one more?
Very, very quickly, and a very quick response.
Okay, I was going to come on to something else substantive, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Mr Harvey. George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Just to follow up on Patrick's last question with regards to radio, did you say, Hayley, that there isn't a playlist? Because that's been one of the big things that's been said out there, is the fact you're moving to a playlist.
Yeah, 70% of our music programming has no playlist. It is selected by either specialist producers who work on the programmes, or in the case of Brian Burnett, my own favourite programme, it's selected by the audience. Only the rest of it, which is a daytime, more mainstream output, which we do, we play, I think, roughly 4 tracks an hour between 10 and 12. We play roughly 4 tracks an hour between 1:30 and 3:30. And we have, this was not, as I say, I think when people say playlist, they mean, kind of press a button on an electronic jukebox. That's not the case. We brought in a music scheduler to refine our playlist, but I think it's something like 1,200 tracks. And it's chosen by an individual who understands our audience and our new head of audio and events in collaboration. And in any given hour, you should hear at least one Scottish track. I heard you talk earlier, I think it was about kind of mandating Scottish music. I don't think we need to do that because we're already playing absolutely masses of it. But no, in those programmes in particular, across all of our evening and weekend schedule, there is no playlisting. But the playlisting is not done by a machine.
There is some confusion. The minute you say playlisting, people start thinking like some of these virtual broadcasters that are effectively, they record it 24 hours before with the presenter, and it's just literally pressing a button and the songs come out.
Yes, that's not, we don't have that anywhere in our schedule.
Yeah. One of the other things, obviously in radio and broadcast in particular, there's been a concern over the years that there's been a kind of pullback, not just so much from yourselves, but more from the commercial side. But we're living in a place where it's hugely competitive for you all, because on the commercial side, Global have left Scotland, came back with their 2 major radio stations, and you also have STV Radio, which has just been launched as well. Now, luckily for me, I seem to be the demographic that you seem to be going for in Radio Scotland and STV Radio, so I seem to be quite enjoying radio at the moment. But the whole idea that is that, you know, it is quite competitive. And in order for BBC Radio Scotland to mean, because I was going to ask about the 1 million listeners to 800,000, that's quite a drop. And you had to do something to actually change that and make sure that the radio station was... Because if you take football away from Radio Scotland, there's quite a whack of that 800,000 away as well.
Yes, I mean, you know, I could talk about radio all day. I'm very, very passionate about radio, as you know. The thing with radio, and you know, we talk about kind of linear television and the drop-off in numbers, and why we're kind of concentrating on our digital services. Radio is not in decline. There is a fight to be won here. There is a market for radio overall. The number of listening hours is not going down. You're absolutely right. The competition in Scotland is fierce because we're competing against other Scottish services. You know, many of them, you know, commercial, as you say, but we also compete against the rest of the UK. You know, a decent number of people in Scotland listen to the Today programme or to Radio 2, and those are, you know, quality things. So we have to find a way for Radio Scotland, which is the national radio station, the only one, to compete and attract an audience. And, you know, my sense is, you know, we can talk about age demographics or whatever. I don't really adhere to the age demographic thing quite as much as some others in my industry do. I think it's about tone of voice. I think we attract people because we have a certain tone of voice, because they come to us for a warmth, an inclusivity, a place where they will hear, yes, you know, I mean, this morning we were doing obviously a lot of news on Greenland, but distinctively Scottish news output, distinctively Scottish conversation. It is the place where Scottish conversation should happen. Distinctively Scottish music, distinctively Scottish culture, you know, and obviously distinctively Scottish sport. And the key, the trick in all of this, and it's not an easy trick to pull off, but the trick in all of this is for all of those different genres across, you know, a national radio station, which by definition, including all the ops that we do to the various parts of the country, looking after specific audiences, is to bring all of that together through something that feels like it is a warm, inclusive, distinctive, you know, a respectful, identity-based tone of voice. And I think, you know, in our radio, we are not looking for 25-year-olds. We accept that they are probably going elsewhere. But we do think that across a really broad age demographic, we can bring those people back in, because we're now offering that in a way that we haven't been before. I mean, really simple things like our new head of audio events has worked really hard to get our presenters to talk to each other and about each other's shows in a way that feels authentic and real, and you can hear it. You can hear the difference, that they are talking up each other's shows in a way that makes you think they have actually listened to them, which they actually have.
I quite like the chattiness, because if I want to just listen to music, I'll put Spotify or some streamer on and just listen to music, you know, so I enjoy the chatting. I know some people have complained about the chattiness and the kind of flagship news show in the morning, but I personally prefer it. But in questions in general, you mentioned sport there, because I mentioned it, but also in your opening remarks, and it's great the Scotland games are now on BBC. I'd like to ask, what are the kind of long-term ideas about that as you go into the future, when there's obviously an opportunity to bid for other qualifying games in the future? We're going to look to keep that. And the disappointment of the Commonwealth Games leaving the BBC for the first time and going to TNT and behind a paywall, you know, which effectively for me in athletics, it's the only time I've got a team to support. You know, so basically, you know, that's disappointing as well. And how did we end up in that position?
Yeah, I'll start with the football. Obviously, we have the football up until including the World Cup. We are currently working on our World Cup plans. We're very ambitious for those, both in terms of, you know, covering the games in America, but also covering the bringing together of the country around a national event like that in this country. So a lot of our reporting will be here. We treat these things as, you know, bringing the nation together. They work like nothing else. And the football, you know, as you know, I worked pretty hard and pushed very hard for the Scotland rights, and it has, as I've said earlier, really paid off, not just in terms of numbers of people watching in Scotland, but numbers of people watching the Scotland team across the whole of the UK, and numbers of people who will come back to us for something like a Scotland game and then stay for something else. So in terms of that kind of wider strategy of bringing people into the BBC, it has really worked. You know, I will be ambitious to carry on that. You know, that you know, we're not in those conversations yet. but I will be ambitious to keep the Scotland Games on free-to-air.
But you've told us previously you had to get buy-in from BBC centrally as well
Yes.
in order to do that.
Yes, and I think part of the argument we were arguing in theory before that this would be a good thing for the whole of the UK, and we had match funding as it was, Scotland money and network money that went into the Scotland Games. I think the evidence is that it is paid off in terms of raw numbers for the whole of the UK. Huge numbers of people watching the Scotland Games. A friend said to me recently, who was up from London, that he got his kids out of bed and said, "This is the best football match you'll ever watch," and you get back up and watch it. And he, is a Londoner living in London. So, I think that the argument is one on that, but whether the financials, let's not pretend that the BBC is in a great financial position. Everything we do means we stop doing something else to pay for it. So we will have to find the money. So I'm not guaranteeing anything on that, but you know where my ambitions lie. On the Commonwealth Games, I was obviously very disappointed. I'm a sport fan. I think that it is great for our audiences, and as you say, it's one of the few places where people get to wear the Scotland jersey to represent their country. It's a competitive world, and we were outbid. That is the straightforward nature of it, and I really hope that TNT make a brilliant job of it for the audience. I really hope that you and all other sports fans in Scotland get to see as much of the Commonwealth Games as possible. So I wish them all the luck in the world. Doesn't mean I'm not disappointed, because I am. We will still cover the Commonwealth Games as much as we possibly can. I mean, there's an open conversation. As you know, Commonwealth Games are Category B listed, so there's a conversation about highlights to be had. The highlights have to be on free-to-air. I don't know what TNT's plans are in that way. The highlights will have to be somewhere on free-to-air, so whether they're going to make them free-to-air or talk to another broadcaster, we don't know that yet. But across the piece, the conversations are not quite over. But we will make sure that we cover the Commonwealth Games. I mean, for a Scottish audience away from the kind of the live events, which obviously are a big deal, these are often the places where we discover new talent, where we learn about new athletes coming through, and we will cover ones to watch as the Commonwealth Games approach. We will do nightly slots into our news programmes about the Commonwealth Games with as much footage as we can have of the Commonwealth Games. As the backstory of the parents who've taken their kids to the swimming pool at 5 in the morning for 20 years or whatever it might be is often the thing that grabs the nation's attention, and we will do as much of that as we possibly can.
Okay, just on television production, Hayley, you told this committee it's your ambition for every reaching network quota to qualify in at least 2 criteria. I think you mentioned it earlier on today as well. But this hasn't been the case at this stage. Why is that?
So if we have a very succinct answer.
Try my best.
My apologies.
As I said, I think we're up to about 90% of our quota is made up of programmes which qualify on at least 2 criteria. So it's very much the minority. That's right. I'm not misquoting anything. It's very much the minority. And as I said, we've made steps and public announcements about the fact that we will try as we go forward that only by exception will programmes qualify, or will we accept programmes which only qualify on 1 criteria.
Very quickly, Convener, just basically, how do you mentioned it the last time when you were here about the new dramas that you're doing, and Councils is produced by Balloon Entertainment in London, Grams is produced by World Productions London. Will they at least hit 2 of the criteria for qualifying for Scotland?
Yes, I mean, Louise, I think that they have bases here. Balloon certainly has a base here, so
yes,
they qualify on all 3.
They both have bases actually. World, the originator of Vigil lives and works in Scotland and works for World Scotland, so they do have bases here. And Councils is being execed by the exec producer who lives and works in Scotland.
So they qualify in all 3 then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And Councils is in production, so we're very excited about it. It is employing hundreds of people, a cast of 90, a lot of new talent coming through. There was a sort of nervousness about would we support new talent. The 6 leads, very young actors, bringing through new talent. It is filming in lots of different locations, including studios and out and about across Scotland.
Is that the one Mary Black's in?
Yes.
So if I don't win the election, can I bid for a place?
You can audition in the same way that Mary did.
I think that's probably the opportunity to move on. Thank you. Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. The On the changes to the Radio Scotland schedule, something I've raised in the committee before and I've raised with the BBC as well, I just welcome the assurances that have been given about the importance that Radio Scotland will play on emerging Scottish artists and maintaining that number of hours. I think also, in terms of listening to the voice of the audience, I think it would be fair to say also the presenters and the shows were much valued by their listeners as well, and that's something that's been raised by with me. Obviously, I know the BBC will keep that under review in terms of how those changes develop and plan out. I just wanted to ask about, lastly, just about local democracy reporters and the fact that the BBC funds local democracy reporters, and we talked right at the start about the importance that the BBC places on local news and the events in the North East and the Highlands in terms of the recent weather. These reporters are funded by the BBC but employed by local or regional news organisations. The purpose of the scheme is to provide impartial coverage of the regular business and workings of local authorities in the UK and other relevant democratic institutions. 165 across the UK. I don't know how many of these are local democracy reporters are in Scotland. As you said at the start, the BBC is one of the most trusted, or the most trusted news source that we have. How can we ensure that BBC Scotland has enough locally based journalists to maintain that high standard of accuracy for Scottish audiences? We've had STV here recently talking about their cuts in terms of regional news, which is obviously they have had specialist news programmes for STV North and different regional variations. They're obviously looking to cut the number of journalists that they have. STV are claiming they're going to provide more content with less journalists. I still struggle to see how that's going to be the case. But in terms of the BBC's own journalist base, but also the democracy reporters, how are you going to maintain that level of local news coverage?
I think, and again, you're better at the numbers, but I think we have 21 local democracy reporters.
Generally speaking, there's one local democracy reporter for every 2 local authorities across the UK. But in Scotland, partly because of the geography, we upped the investment from the average, and there's about 21 for the 32 local authorities. Yeah.
So it's one of the things we're discussing in relation to Charter, because we know that audiences want more local news. And I think in a world where, there are lots and lots of news providers, from kind of Facebook groups up to national broadcasters, the sort of hyper-local is becoming more and more of a thing, and we are absolutely committed to covering that. So we're looking at whether we should expand the number of local democracy reporters. I think it's an interesting conversation that we haven't come to firm conclusions on. I heard John McClellan saying that that there's a risk in Scotland in moving them into, for example, court reporting, because we have a really active court agency service that we don't want to undermine. So we will look at where we think it is useful to increase the number of local democracy reporters. But I think for the sake of the next Charter, and this is, as I say, an ongoing conversation, and more of that sort of model is certainly something that we're open to. So whether it's we have apprentices. As you know, we have, I think, 60-odd, 70-odd in Scotland at the moment, and they spend their apprenticeships in different BBC departments. It's a possibility, something that we're discussing, that the apprentices would spend some of their time with externals, working with other organisations, would benefit them undoubtedly, would benefit us undoubtedly as well, and would support the broader sector, I think, in certain ways. There's obviously some risk to it. If you send your reporters to work on the Daily Mail and they start writing stories about you, it's not perfect. But I do think, broadly speaking, how we support the local sector is an important part of our responsibilities. So that's where I am on that. But as I say, with some caution that we don't want to undermine, an active sector like the court sector in Scotland. So, but we are absolutely talking about it, and a more open approach to how we work with other organisations. In terms of STV, I've said this publicly before, but I take no pleasure in the cuts at STV at all. It is very good for us to have active competition across the whole of the country. It is very good for us to have, we've got several of our best journalists in our Aberdeen newsroom, for example, who've come through the STV system, and we work closely with them on things like pooling and all sorts of active relationships that we have with STV in the north. I recognise and understand the kind of dilemma of making more content with fewer journalists. and I kind of feel their pain. It's not something that we are about to replicate. We are absolutely committed to being outside of the Central Belt in all of our regions. And as I say, as I said at the beginning, I think we have 14 bases, 12 of which have journalists in them, and we're committed to keeping those.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that concludes the questions for today. Thank you.
We answer another question. Could I just flag one issue and ask if BBC Scotland would write to us?
Of course.
Just about an issue we didn't have time to. I was going to ask about the deal that was announced with YouTube, about providing BBC content on YouTube, and in particular two concerns. One is it's taking more audience share than the BBC now for the first time. Is there a danger that this simply enriches the offer of a rival rather than benefiting the BBC? And secondly, that BBC content would therefore be presented alongside whatever YouTube's algorithm throws at people, including extremism, far-right content, conspiracy content, and that this could degrade trust in the BBC's output by presenting it in that context. I know we don't have time to get into an answer, but if you'd be willing to write to us on those issues, I'd be very grateful.
We haven't got time because we've got another panel. So if you'd be happy to write to us on that, that would be appreciated. Thank you again, everybody, for their contributions, and we'll take a short break before the other panel. Thank you. Welcome back. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence from the Auditor-General for Scotland on his Section 22 report on Historic Environment Scotland. We're joined by Stephen Boyle, Auditor-General for Scotland, and Letha Duthie, Audit Director, Audit Scotland. Welcome to you both. And I understand you will be giving a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning to the committee. Convener, very grateful to join the committee, and thank you, first of all, for the invitation to speak to you about the Section 22 report that I published last month on the 2024-25 audit of Historic Environment Scotland. And I produced that report under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. The report brought to Parliament's attention unacceptable governance at Historic Environment Scotland, including weaknesses in procurement, personal data breaches and unclear processes for the distribution and use of complementary tickets at events at its venues. It also identified arrangements which we also considered unacceptable in respect of the Archive House project. This is a project that continued to incur expenditure despite being cancelled in 2024, and that the decision to end the project was not supported by either appropriate governance or scrutiny within the organisation. I note that Historic Environment Scotland is navigating a period of significant instability and challenge. During 2025, it operated without a chief executive or accountable officer for almost 6 months of the year. I do recognise the complexity of this situation, but I also believe that the Scottish Government should have appointed a substitute accountable officer to provide the continued necessary leadership and accountability during that period. I appreciate the committee knows many of the matters well about Historic Environment Scotland. And you'll clearly have seen that a new chair is now in place, together with an interim chief operating officer who was also recently appointed. It's critical, therefore, that strong controls are now put in place to prevent the risk of fraud and demonstrate that value for money is being achieved. The appointed auditor, Letha Duthie, who's with me this morning, will continue to monitor developments during the annual audit process, including the progress towards the implementation of audit recommendations. And as I do following Section 22 reports, Convener, I'll give further consideration to whether there's any follow-up reporting to Parliament on progress. Very happy to be here and very much looking forward to answering the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before I bring in colleagues, can I just ask a very simple, I suppose, question? How surprised were you, Auditor General, with the extent of the failings uncovered by your report?
So these are unusual circumstances for a public body, Convener. As I regularly say to the Public Audit Committee when I produce a Section 22 report, most public bodies in Scotland are well run. They receive clean audit opinions, their annual audit reports that the auditors produce. While many include recommendations, they're certainly not of the scale or significance that are highlighted in the audit report on Historic Environment Scotland. I think what is set out in the report is that there are many matters to address in terms of its leadership, governance, its internal control environment, that it can put the necessary, proper, rigorous arrangements so that it can do what it's there to do, to provide those vital services. But I think what's also really particularly relevant in this context, this is an organisation that's generating over £70 million of additional income for public services in Scotland. That is unusual in the scale of a public body, but it perhaps also illustrates the point that even more rigorous arrangements are necessary in such circumstances. So it is unusual, Convener, and that really prompted me, particularly given the strength of the content of the auditor's report, to prepare this report for Parliament.
So unusual. So how would you, from your experience, how would you place what you've uncovered or what you've been dealing with there in the context of perhaps other the problems you've seen at Historic Scotland in the wider picture of other public bodies that have been subject to a Section 22 report in recent years?
Yeah, it's towards the end of the challenging spectrum, if I can put it in those terms. I prepare statutory reports or Section 22 reports on an annual basis. So every year I'll prepare a statutory report on the Scottish Government, not because, as sometimes is characterised by a Section 22 report as a what went wrong style report, but rather just to support parliamentary interest, public interest in the scale of activities and spending of the Scottish Government. Other reports are more in that alternative category of kind of where events have gone wrong within a public body. And there are many challenges set out in today's report for the organisation to focus on, but particularly to guard against the risk that I think of the need for effective governance, scrutiny, high quality internal controls within the organisation that reflect the range of activities that they're dealing with. It's not just a public body delivering services, but because they have this large other income commercial activity going on inside the organisation, not within a subsidiary, that they need to get these arrangements strengthened, monitored and improved.
You suggested it was the worst end. Would you say this is the worst case that you've dealt with?
I think it's hard to pin down relative to other Section 22 reports. There are examples, and I've produced some in recent years, which have also included really significant deficiencies in how a public body was run. There are parallels within this report today. Rather than saying where it rests on a particular spectrum, I think it's clearly, I hope it's set out in the report, is that there are many issues to be addressed. One point I would maybe make, Convener, is that we welcomed the response to the Section 22 report from the new chair of Historic Environment Scotland. The intention in terms of reviewing its effectiveness, the culture of the organisation. And as I gave evidence to the Public Audit Committee on the report 2 weeks or so ago, and there was discussion about culture. So I was pleased that the chair, through this review process that they're now undertaking, is including that as part of it, because I think resolving some of the issues, while necessary, I don't underestimate the scale. These are complex issues in terms of leadership, governance, activities for the organisation under the leadership of the chair to take forward.
So I'm very conscious of firstly our time, but I think interest in this, so I will move on to Member Stephen Kerr.
How did this happen to Historic Environment Scotland? What's your assessment? Maybe that's one for Lisa, because you've got into the forensic details of the organisation. How on earth did we get to this place?
So I think probably the starting point is to refer you to the appendix of our Section 22 report, which sets out, I suppose, the extent of the instability in leadership over that period of time. And a number of the matters that we refer to that we've reported on today fall within that period. So that starts, I suppose, with the appointment, the interim appointments when the previous Director of Finance and Corporate Services and Chief Executive left, and then the appointment of a permanent Chief Executive in September, and then subsequently her absence and, as we say, the lack of appointment of a substitute accountable officer in that time.
So the HES has been pretty much unstable in terms of the management of its own affairs for a considerable period of time. We're talking about more than 2 years?
Well, the leadership, there's been instability in the leadership dating back to 2023.
Yeah. I mean, so the 6 months that was highlighted by the Auditor General when Historic Environment Scotland did not have an accountable officer, in your professional judgment, this is not directed solely at you, Lisa, at what point did this lack of an accountable officer move from being understandable to being unacceptable?
I think the first thing I would reference, Mr Kerr, I've seen the correspondence that the committee has received from the Cabinet Secretary and the evidence that the committee has taken from the Cabinet Secretary and his officials. And I think what we set out, I think, and hopefully in our report, both the annual audit report and the Section 22 report, is that this was a fluid set of circumstances. So, so the absence, any organisation won't necessarily know straight away how long a chief executive is going to be off. And we also understand, and I think it's set out again in the correspondence, that there was something of a to and fro about prospective acting or interim arrangements. And then that was also interrupted by the changeover or early resignation of the former chair of Historic Environment Scotland too. So I think these are all contextual points. But I think at some point, what we have before us is an organisation that was going through challenge that operated without an accountable officer. So we think the Scottish Government should have appointed a substitute or acting accountable officer during this period. It should have acted sooner than it did. Mm-hmm. We also disagree with the assertion that when the accountable officer did return to work, that they were able to discharge their duties solely in respect of the annual report and accounts. And now, since the accounts have been signed, by discharging it in respect of the response to the Section 22 report. We're quite clear, and indeed not just me, the Scottish Public Finance Manual is quite clear about what the duties of the accountable officer are. And those can't really be distilled down to a transaction here or there. They're all-encompassing. They're personal responsibilities set out for that person by the Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government. So I think what matters is that there's a period now of response and stability, but as quickly as possible, the organisation is able to have clear lines of accountability through an accountable officer so that it can move on and bring, as I say, bring that stability back to this organisation.
Just to update the committee and those watching these proceedings, and there will be a few, because this is an issue that has generated quite a lot of interest beyond the organisation itself. The current arrangements for an accountable officer within HES, how would you describe them? Who exactly is carrying out all the totality of those responsibilities as described in the Scottish Public Finance Manual?
So the committee will be familiar, I hope, that the Chief Executive has returned to work with Historic Environment Scotland, but in a limited capacity. So we understand that those responsibilities, and I'll bring Lisa in to say a bit more about the specifics. Initially, was to discharge those responsibilities in respect of the annual report and accounts, and now it's in response to the Section 22 report and external engagement. Alongside that, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Chair of Historic Environment Scotland has also brought in a Chief Operating Officer to provide leadership management for the executive leadership team. So I would describe it as a hybrid, but I don't think that hybrid is fully captured in the Scottish Public Finance Manual.
No.
So ultimately, you cannot delegate the responsibility of being an accountable officer. It still resides with that individual that's appointed by the Permanent Secretary. And I think what we have at the moment is, as I say, Mr Kerr, something of a hybrid style arrangement that I'm not clear that maps fully across to the requirements of the SPFM.
So as we sit here today, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you wouldn't let me anyway, because you're very accomplished. HES doesn't appear to satisfy the requirement of the Scottish Public Finance Manual in having an accountable person as accountable officer as things stand, because hybrids, there is no contingency for hybrids.
So I think I guess that will be for the organisation to assert how it is meeting those requirements. Lisa might have a view. She's obviously been around the organisation more regularly than I am, but I can't quite reconcile those very specific duties of an accountable officer with the arrangements that HES currently have. So they have people, they have senior, credible people in the organisation, but not necessarily what you would say is an arrangement that's consistent with those delegations.
You can't delegate that role. There has to be a named individual, according to the Scottish Public Finance Manual.
So that named individual is the Chief Executive. And
but not fulfilling that role.
But, well, that would be my assertion that I'm not clear how they can discharge those responsibilities with the nature of the duties that they are currently able to fulfil. As the committee, if I may say, as the committee knows that there are still circumstances that we refer to in the report that are still ongoing, complex HR matters within the organisation.
Yes, we might come to those, but I know time is restricted. Lisa, you've been referred to a few times there. Do you want to?
Thank you. So the Auditor General has obviously set out, the current arrangement. So the Chief Executive is back at work in a somewhat limited capacity. But importantly, a Chief Operating Officer has been appointed for a 6-month period. That individual is leading the executive leadership team and the day-to-day operations and providing, I suppose, bridging the gap there between the executive leadership team and the accountable officer.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that, but it would appear, I'm going to assert something now, and that is that under the provisions of the Scottish Public Finance Manual, at the moment, there is not clearly defined person who's fulfilling the role of accountable officer as per the manual, as per the requirement. And you've used diplomatic language, but I'm interpreting that way. Please do jump in and say, no, you've completely misinterpreted what we're saying, Mr Kerr. This is completely not the case. But it sounds to me like we're in an unsatisfactory position where there's delegations that are not permitted that are going on, and there's someone in a role that isn't in a position to fulfil the full measure of the accountable officer role.
it will be absolutely desirable for this organisation to move on from these arrangements as quickly as possible, so that it has a clear, accountable officer who is discharging all of the responsibilities that are set out in the SPFM. We're not in that position at the moment. So
the committee's role, obviously, is to scrutinise the Scottish Government, particularly in the case of this example as a non-departmental public body, the role of the Cabinet Secretary, who is directly responsible for this body. So you say that the Scottish Government did not. I think what the Section 22 report clearly states is the Scottish Government did not act in a timely way, or even in an urgent way, to deal with the issues. And in the report there is talk about green to amber to red ratings. The situation is still the same then, if we don't have an accountable officer by the definition of the Scottish Public Finance Manual. Are we still at red?
So it's my understanding that it is. I think you mentioned some of the traffic light flow changed from green to amber in May 25 and then from amber to red in August of 25.
Are we still at red?
That's my understanding. If there's an update, I can come back to the committee in writing.
So we still haven't had action from the Scottish Government, from the Office of the Cabinet Secretary, to remedy a situation where we have got a significant, a very important body in terms of Historic Environment Scotland who are operating at a red status.
If I may, I don't think I would say that we haven't seen action. I think what you have seen is the appointment of a new chair, together with a chief operating officer, that brings some stability to the organisation, that allows them to respond not just to the events in our reports, but also to some of the concerns raised by others, the internal audit function, for example. So while I agree that the issue with the accountable officer needs to be resolved, I think what we've seen is some response. And in terms of the traffic light grading that the Scottish Government gives to its sponsored bodies, that's a decision for portfolio accountable officers to arrive at through their own assurance processes. It's unusual for an organisation to be red, but actually, and it'll be a decision for the portfolio accountable officer. But given some of these circumstances, I'm not altogether surprised that it's remained at red. I think maybe what you would hope to see during 2026, evidence of progress that would allow them to de-escalate that situation.
But at the very least, the Cabinet Secretary should have acted to see that there was a substitute accountable officer in place, and we still don't have that.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly, as I mentioned, Mr. Kerr, I've seen the correspondence that kind of sets out some of the to and fro about why the Scottish Government's view circumstances transpired that didn't lead to an substitute accountable officer being appointed. I think, as I've said this morning and clearly set out in our report, we think at some point a decision should just have been taken. That there needed to be, certainly during the audit, the accounts process, but just for day-to-day operations, that there was that level of clear lines of accountability and oversight that only an accountable officer discharging all of the responsibilities can satisfactorily do.
And you mentioned other issues, the toxicity of the workplace, which has been widely reported, and of course we express our gratitude to those who have been courageous enough to whistleblow on some of the aspects of the toxicity of the organisational culture inside HES. Do you have any concerns about the fact that Sir Mark Jones, who no doubt has his hands full, is currently only working, his contract is only for 2 days a week, and a brand new chief operating officer? Do you have any concerns that, while those are two very positive things that have happened, that to deal with the ingrained nature of the toxicity, to deal with the culture of this organisation, it's going to require something more than this? Would you have a view, for example, on whether or not there ought, before now, or at least now, be some form of external independent review of the organisation and its workings and its culture?
So a couple of things. I will turn to Lisa, actually, because I think she'll have insight to the capacity of the leadership within the organisation with these circumstances. The point I would make and welcome is that the organisation has initiated a review of its effectiveness and its culture in response to some of the allegations that were made through whistleblowers, together with some of the audit findings. We hope that's concluded swiftly, and we understand that that's due to run until the spring of this year. We understand also that...
Is this internal?
So I think it's Lisa can share some of the details that we have, Mr Kerr. We understand that they're bringing in an experienced leader from outside the organisation to run this exercise. So that, again, that feels like a positive development in response to tackling the issues. The one caveat I would, of course, make is some of these are really complex issues. You know, and I appreciate the committee have seen some of the correspondence and the allegations, convener, that will require in-depth process. There's always a balance to be struck. Of course, you want it done quickly, but you also want it done properly and thoroughly. So how that translates into the capacity of the leadership of the chair and the chief operating officer, I'll maybe turn to Lisa if can further comments or insight on that.
Thank you, Auditor General. So the review of the effectiveness of Historic Environment Scotland and the culture, I understand, has commenced. So an external person has been appointed to carry out that review, and we expect that to be concluded around May 2026, if that progresses well. As the Auditor General has already mentioned, with the appointment of a new chair, the appointment of a chief operating officer, and 2 interim board members for a period of 12 months, we've seen a number of actions being taken to resolve the current situation. I think it's probably also worth pointing out the principal risks that Historic Environment Scotland recognises in its own annual report and financial statements, and one of those is people and culture. So specifically, some actions to mitigate that risk. There's the Wellbeing Pulse Survey that they undertake, and also ongoing engagement with staff and a people strategy. So we can see a recognition of the risks that exist, particularly around culture, and action being taken to resolve that.
Okay, and I suppose one final question. Yes? Okay. One final question really is about, is a continuation of the discussion about the current status. So I dwelt, maybe too long, I don't know, on the accountable officer, but it seems like one of the crucial issues that comes out of the Section 22, but also the issue around internal controls in relation to things like the 400 purchasing cards, which seems an extraordinary number of purchasing cards in an organisation with, I think, if I remember correctly, 1,200 employees. What has changed in the last month in relation to the issues that you've highlighted that are related directly to financial and internal control?
Yeah, thank you. So what I can say is that as well as the work that we carried out on the electronic purchasing cards during the year, Internal Audit carried out a detailed review of the use of those cards. And I refer in my annual audit report to their recommendations. So that was a limited assurance report, and there were 9 recommendations within that were accepted by the management of Historic Environment Scotland. So we expect to see progress against that. That report was issued in August, and it went to the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee, I think, in November time. So that's something that we'll follow up as part of our 25-26 audit.
And having accepted the recommendations of that internal report, do you have any idea whether any of those recommendations that have been accepted have now been actioned? And will it see a reduction in the proliferation of purchase cards?
So what we haven't done yet, and we will do as part of our 25-26 audit, is follow up on those recommendations. I can also say that there's a meeting of the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee in February, and we'd expect to see a status update on all internal recommendations within the organisation at that meeting.
I appreciate a short time, and I've taken a lot of time, and I'm grateful to my fellow committee members for allowing me that indulgence, but I think I probably...
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Kell. Bring in Neil Bibby and then following up with Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Just to go back to, I think, the convener's questions at the start, there was kind of similar issues, I think, identified in the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, and that led to a government review and changes, and at the same time, there's obviously been serious issues at Historic Environment Scotland. I asked the Cabinet Secretary for Culture when he was last here discussing it, what assurances can we have that these cultural issues, financial issues, are not happening in other parts of the culture sector? And he said there's no other issues in other parts of the culture sector. What confidence can we have that these aren't replicated? I know, I appreciate you've got 200 public bodies to look at, but in other parts of the culture sector.
So I think the assurance I can give the committee this morning is that a Section 22 report is rare. So auditors who I appoint, we don't just do an audit of the accounts in the public sector in Scotland. We also look at what we call a wider scope audit, look at financial management, financial sustainability, governance and leadership and value for money as well. Those can, well, an audit is never, it's not foolproof an audit, you know. So, but those warning signs are not being set out through our audit work on other public bodies. I mentioned already this morning that some of the sponsorship arrangements within the Scottish Government are another indicator of, or a temperature test of how public bodies are performing. So similarly, you mentioned the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, and clearly that's one of the most significant examples of a public body in recent years with challenges. But these are unusual. We think that the arrangements through public audit, and for the most part sponsorship, Mr Bibby, I wouldn't say that there is still work to do on sponsorship arrangements with public bodies. So as we set out in my report on the Scottish Government, which I referred to earlier, the Scottish Government's made progress on sponsorship. That is clear. But there are still aspects of some of the sophistication of how sponsorship works effectively to be tackled. So I'm not in a position, as you would expect, to give blanket assurance that these issues are not being replicated. But actually, I'll maybe just invite Lisa back in, actually, because I think just in terms of the consideration of findings from previous parliamentary inquiries or audit reports and the extent to which they were used by Historic Environment Scotland, which may be of interest to the committee.
Yeah, thank you. And I think some of the issues that we raised in our report, so these were brought to my attention through the risk assessment process of the audit early on, both through the previous appointed auditor, but also through the internal audit service within Historic Environment Scotland. So there are a number of, and that I suppose relates specifically to the electronic purchasing cards issue that you see. I suppose from an auditor's perspective, we would regularly carry out high level risk assessments. You know, in this area, quite often it's not material to the audit. So as you'd expect, we don't carry out detailed testing. But you know, I would expect that would come up through the risk assessment if it were an issue.
Thank you. You've talked about the unacceptable weaknesses in governance, and I think sometimes unacceptable is probably a word that's used by, I would say, not by Audit Scotland, but in the political sphere as not really meaning anything when governments say situations are unacceptable. But then accept the situations. I'm not criticising you here, but there seems to be, obviously, you talked about the situation with, you know, the unacceptable weaknesses, the desire for HES to move on from its current arrangements in relation to the accountable officer as soon as possible. We've had the situation, obviously, with the as you said, you know, invoices for farewell dinners, non-compliance with foreign travel, poor monitoring of expenditure, 400 credit cards issued to staff, and almost 2 million spent on these credit cards. What powers do you and the Scottish Government have to turn an unacceptable situation into an acceptable situation?
So,
and to what extent has HES got to, you know, obviously the desire is for HES to get its own house in order, but ultimately what powers do you and the Scottish Government have to ensure they get those changes?
And those powers are quite different. So my powers are set out in the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act, and I have no powers of intervention. So my responsibilities allow me to report publicly on matters arising, such as Section 22, through an annual audit, which we've done in this case, or Section 23, where I undertake wider value for money studies on particular topics across public services. On the I'll return to the Scottish Government point in a moment, actually, but in terms of the unacceptable governance, and you refer to a number of those, Mr Bibby, the substance of those, I think, just for completeness, is about perhaps the absence of policy arrangements, compliance with policies in terms of hospitality, the allocation of complementary tickets, procurement arrangements not always being followed, data breaches in the organisation which are being investigated, there not being a formal register of interests for senior leadership within the organisation. These are all points that are accompanied by recommendations that can be fixed. So, I mean, they are not terribly unusual factors or complex issues that can be resolved. So I don't think it's a case of powers in many respects as following proper processes, having effective policies, implementing them so that it keeps the public body safe, it keeps people who are working for the public body, within parameters that they can operate safely. On the Scottish Government's powers, so you mentioned sponsorship a couple of times already. So the Scottish Government officials provide that level of sponsorship, engagement, support and challenge to the public bodies that they are working with. But ultimately, ministers will have powers to direct public bodies. So, as there's been some discussion of that in recent years about written authority or ministerial direction. So there's a range of alternatives that the Scottish Government has to deploy. But I think really it probably have a level of complexity well below that. These are just arrangements that can be fixed. Some of the cultural factors, will take perhaps longer time to investigate, to conclude in terms of that independent review. But I don't see a level of insurmountable issues in this report that should derail the organisation while it's addressing them.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that the reasons given by the Scottish Government for not appointing a substitute accountable officer. One of the things, I would be keen, obviously you've had, you'll have conversations and correspondence with the Scottish Government and HES on this issue. Mr Kerr actually asked Mr Robertson in a parliamentary question whether the Scottish Government will publish the correspondence it's received from Audit Scotland regarding the reported governance failures at Historic Environment Scotland. And Mr Robertson replied the Scottish Government did not receive any direct correspondence from Audit Scotland. I don't know if he's received indirect correspondence or not, but he goes on to say that the further correspondence from Audit Scotland in Section 22 may have been received directly by Historic Environment Scotland. Are you able to publish that the correspondence you've had with the Scottish Government or HES, just in terms of understanding the reasons that you've just cited there, that they've taken particular positions?
Sure, I'm very happy to set that out for the committee, how that operates. So, actually, and Lisa, I'm sure might want to explain it from the annual audit process as well. So, when I received the auditor's annual audit report, and as I did a number of weeks before publication, I read that report, as I do with all the annual audit reports that auditors produce. I see that there are matters of significance that, in my view, we felt warranted to prepare a statutory report. Lisa, together with colleagues in Audit Scotland, supported the drafting of that. It's a draft document, and I then send that to Historic Environment Scotland, so the correspondence to that effect, as what we call a fact-checking process. So that allows Historic Environment Scotland to confirm the factual accuracy and to offer any other thoughts and comments. So that process is set out. But the Cabinet Secretary is correct. We don't write to the Scottish Government in that regard. This is a correspondence that we have with the individual public body. What we don't proactively do is to publish the drafts of our reports. We would consider any request to do that, either from this committee or from a member of the public through Freedom of Information, and we would reflect on that appropriately, Mr Bibby. But the process, rather than being with the Scottish Government, a statutory report is on an individual public body, and that's where the correspondence resides. But if you're content for a moment, maybe invite Lisa in just to say a bit more about the clearance of the annual audit report, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe just add a small amount of detail on the scope of the Section 22 report. So once the Auditor General had made that decision, so that scope was issued to Historic Environment Scotland, and at the time to one of the directors. Obviously the Chief Executive was absent at the time, and that, I requested in that email that was shared with the full Executive Leadership Team and the sponsor team as well for information. So that was, so they would have been notified at that time as well. I think just in terms of the context of our engagement with both Historic Environment Scotland and the Scottish Government throughout the absence. So my colleague Carol Grant, who's an Audit Director for Audit Scotland and Engagement Lead for the Scottish Government Audit, she engaged directly with the sponsor team on their understanding of the position and what action was being taken to identify a substitute accountable officer. From the Historic Environment Scotland side, I had various engagements with the former chair of the board, and also members of the executive leadership team as well, and the chair of the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee. So it was a substantial engagement during that period.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Mr Bibby. Mr Harvey, and then Keith Brown.
Thank you. Good morning. I was going to ask as well about the lack of appointment of an interim accountable officer, and I'm in agreement that there seems to be a lack of clarity about what happened in this case, but I'm also concerned about a lack of clarity about what's supposed to happen. Any public body might find that their accountable officer has to go on leave for any number of reasons tomorrow, and it seems unclear to me from what we've heard what is supposed to happen. You told the Public Audit Committee, I think last week, that in my view, a clear intervention ought to have happened at a far earlier date. You said it's the responsibility of the Permanent Secretary as the Principal Accountable Officer of the Scottish Administration to appoint the accountable officers of public bodies. That we previously heard from Angus Robertson, and you know the word responsibility in your phrase there might be open to interpretation. There's a question about where the decision is made. Obviously, the political responsibility rests with the Cabinet Secretary, but where the decision is made is unclear to me. Angus Robertson previously said, at various stages there have been interactions with the board to explore whether there should be an interim accountable officer in place. But given that it's not been clear exactly when the Chief Executive might return, the progress of such a replacement has not been taken forward by the Board of Historic Environment Scotland. And then later in the same meeting, Kenneth Hogg told us they discussed the ongoing situation with the Chief Executive's absence. They discussed whether they could progress to appoint an interim Chief Executive if that is what the board felt it wanted to do. I repeated that I had met with the candidate they had put forward as a potential appointee for an interim or acting Chief Executive role. I confirmed that we had said we were happy to appoint that person as the accountable officer, although the board subsequently did not appoint. So it's unclear to me. Obviously, you know, in the broader sweep of things, political responsibility rests with the Cabinet Secretary. But does the decision rest with Scottish Government officials, or does the decision rest with the board of the public body? And in the absence of a decision, is it simply the case that no decision was made rather than a positive decision not to appoint?
Yeah, I'll try and address all your points, Mr Harvey.
I know it's a bit multidimensional.
No, I appreciate it, and please come back to me if there's anything that I've missed in the points that you've raised. The first one to say is that we have seen examples at periodic intervals of interim accountable officers being appointed within public bodies. For every appointment of an accountable officer, and it is by the Permanent Secretary, who makes the appointment. There is a letter that's sent to the individual because it's a personal responsibility. The personal responsibility for accountable officers is very clear in the Scottish Public Finance Manual. And as I mentioned, at periodic intervals, I see that correspondence. I'm included in that correspondence, as is the Public Audit Committee, for every single example where there's an appointment of an accountable officer, or whether it's a permanent appointment or an interim appointment. So that's part of the reason why my surprise that, notwithstanding the fluid set of circumstances that were set out by the Cabinet Secretary and Mr Hogg, and then the correspondence that this committee received, that at some point a view was taken, this has been going on too long, that we haven't got an interim or substitute arrangement to bring stability. And I do recognise the fluidity that you refer to and is described in the correspondence about potential candidates being sourced, where the respective responsibilities of the board are relative to the Scottish Government. But I stand back from it. I don't think that absence of a decision helped the circumstances that the organisation was facing.
I appreciate that, and I would agree with it, but I'm still keen to understand where the decision rests. You clearly say the appointment is made by the Permanent Secretary.
Yeah.
But at what level is the decision about whether an appointment is to be made taken? Is that taken by the board of a public body in this circumstance? Is it made by officials in the Scottish Government? Is it made by ministers? Or is it made by the Permanent Secretary?
So I don't believe it's made by ministers, is my understanding. I believe this is made at official level. And there's a couple of factors that are relevant. One is that almost always...
Scottish Government officials?
Yes, my apologies.
But
very
the
precise.
Comments in this previous meeting suggest that the decision was made by the board.
Just going to clarify. The chief executive is almost always the accountable officer for a public body. There are a couple of rare examples where that's not the case. They're also an employee of that organisation. So you would typically have a recruitment process that would appoint a chief executive, and that would be run by the board of the organisation. Once that process has gone through, that will then feed through to the Scottish Government officials, the sponsor team, who will complete the necessary recommendation to the Permanent Secretary. So I can see and I accept, therefore, that there are dual interests at play here, that there needed to be perhaps consensus, but if consensus couldn't be reached, ultimately for the Scottish Government to appoint a Permanent Secretary who would have been an interim or acting employee of Historic Environment Scotland.
I'm still looking
to
make the distinction, though, between whether the Scottish Government, through the Permanent Secretary, appoints somebody, but who is it makes the decision about whether an appointment is to be made? Is that the responsibility of the board of a public body in this situation, about whether they believe an appointment is necessary?
So ideally, you would have a consensus.
Yeah.
And these are, this is an extreme example that tests the mechanics and detail of the Scottish Public Finance Manual. And of course, not all of this is written down. So all it typically says that where the accountable officer is going to be absent, I think typically for a month or more, there will be an interim appointed. But it's not the board that appoints the accountable officer. So you would want the board to be in agreement. Of course you would.
Yeah.
But in our view, that responsibility ultimately resides where there is no consensus with the Scottish Government officials.
That responsibility not only to make the appointment, but to decide whether an appointment is to be made.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to briefly suspend proceedings just for a couple of minutes. Welcome back. We'll continue with our evidence session with the Auditor General, Stephen Boyle, and Lisa Duffy, and I'll ask Keith Brown.
Thanks, Convener. I'll be brief. Two questions, really. The first is, because I don't have the full report in front of me, I've got a précis of your Section 22 report. But you mentioned at the beginning about the project, archive project, which I think you'd said had been abandoned, and yet expenditure continued to be made in relation to it. Have you found out the reasons why that was the case?
Yeah, good morning, Mr Brown. I'll bring Lisa in with a bit of detail, but actually one of the things we set out in the report is that we didn't consider there was good enough scrutiny or governance around the cancellation of the Archive House project. Decisions were made without full papers to the board for that to be considered, or indeed for a full discussion at the executive leadership team. And that's really informed some of the overall conclusion that we make here about the quality of and effectiveness of governance and leadership in the organisation to be addressed through some of the audit recommendations and then part of that wider review of culture and effectiveness. But I'll bring Lisa in to set out some of that detail for the committee.
Thank you, Auditor General. So, as we know, there was a situation report that was drafted by one of the directors of Historic Environment Scotland in May 2024, and that sets out some of the difficulties that the project was facing at the time. Some of those are set out in our report around the increasing cost of the project. The cost had almost doubled to over 20 million from the original estimate of 10, and also some governance challenges within that as well. As we've said in our report, from what we can see, that report was not shared with the board at the time, so we weren't able to see the scrutiny and challenge that had taken place in order to reach that decision. We know that the executive leadership team did have sight of that report, but again, the transparency around that decision didn't follow because we were unable to see a record of the discussion or ultimately the decision that was made. What I would add is that in my annual audit report, I included a recommendation that said that the planned lessons learned review of the archive project should be completed prior to any further funding commitments. And I'm pleased to say that that review has been undertaken by the Internal Audit Service. It was issued on the 29th of December, so we expect to see action being taken following that.
Yeah, just to go back to my point, did you find out what the continuing expenditure was in relation to after the project had been cancelled?
Yeah, so the continuing expenditure, so what we've set out in our report is that there was £2 million written off and when the decision was made, so that was money that had been spent on Archive House that could no longer be capitalised. And we also identified another £900,000 which related to project closure, so part of that would have been termination fees. In addition to that, there is the ongoing lease of Archive House, which doesn't break until 2029, and there's limited use of that accommodation at the moment, as we understand. And further to that, there's the short-term solution, which is the lease of John Sinclair House, which also Historic Environment Scotland's incurring costs in relation to that as a temporary solution.
Thanks very much. My only other question really is, I know that we've exchanged these views in the past in the Public Audit Committee, but it surprises me the extent to which the Auditor General's role has changed since it was first conceived, and that the range of things which you now comment on is much greater than it used to be. I think I heard you on the TV this morning talking about how the police should best marshal the resources to fight crime. In that regard, can I ask you just to think a wee bit beyond, it may be beyond what you would normally comment on, but you did say at the start in relation to the fact that Historic Environment Scotland pool in about £70 million of money from external sources. It's certainly been my view, and I think maybe to some extent the views of the committee, that they could do an awful lot more in relation to that. They failed to properly exploit and capitalise on the resources that they have, and by which I mean the buildings and the genealogical kind of resource that they have. Did you come across anything in your report that maybe pointed to that, an under-resourcing of what they could be doing in relation to that, or did governance have an impact on their ability to properly exploit that? I just wonder if you've got any views on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to address the points you raised, Mr Brown. I mean, on the commercial activities of Historic Environment Scotland, Well, first I should say, and Lisa will have an insight into this, we haven't done an audit of the commercial activities. So what's unusual and becoming more prominent in public bodies, and particularly I've reported recently in some of Scotland's colleges, a topic which I appreciate you're familiar with, and some of the activities of those organisations, like Historic Environment Scotland, who are engaging in more commercial activities to generate revenue for their organisation or the wider public sector. Many of our findings, and I will generalise, is that public bodies trying to do that under the public sector body structure, and that not always working to best effect or not having necessary safeguards in place about culture, some commercial activities. So public bodies need to consider really carefully whether they've got the right structure, the right processes, policies when they're engaging in commercial activity. The importance of making best use of resources. And you mentioned the audit that was published this morning. It's a joint report from myself and His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary in Scotland. It's on best value on policing in Scotland. And that looks at resources in the round about how organisations or how policing in Scotland is using the resources at its disposal. I should say those powers are set out in the Police and Fire Reform Act 2012. The wider scope audit that public auditors in Scotland use provides an opportunity to look more holistically about how public money is being used, what outcomes are being achieved, and we set that out through our work programme. In respect of Section 22 report is based on an annual audit and the results from the annual auditor's report. I mentioned earlier in Section 23 of the PFA Act is where I have the opportunity to look more broadly about how public money has been spent on perhaps a more thematic basis. I can give, and I am giving consideration, as I'll engage with Parliament in the next session, as I'm required to do, to consult on my work programme. So I'm going through that process at the moment, and we'll consider your helpful suggestion about the commercial activities and making best use of resources, not just in policing, of course, but across the piece.
That was my last question. Just a quick comment on that to say that it's we have different views, I think, on the extent to which your office ranges across public activities, but I would certainly, for my part anyway, very much welcome the routine examination of where public bodies can do an awful lot more in terms of the entrepreneurial activities that they do, especially when they have remarkable, unique resources like Historic Environment Scotland. So I'll be interested to see what that wider report says. And just to mention, I think I'm right in saying that the Cabinet Secretary has previously said words to the effect that he's taken the reins off Historic Environment Scotland to allow them to do this. So any suggestions you'd have in relation to what kind of structure would best be able to facilitate that would be useful.
So I'm careful always of boundaries about what my role is not one to advise public bodies in terms of independence. But I recognise the point you make, and I think Historic Environment Scotland has a new framework agreement in place that was agreed with the Scottish Government, I think in 2024. Thank you. But again, as you rightly say, Mr Brown, affords them more licence with which to make best use of their resource. As I mentioned, either on an individual body basis, but probably on a more thematic basis, it's something I'll give careful consideration to about how resources are being used to best value effectively across the services I'm responsible for auditing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have time for some brief follow-up questions. I know Mr Kerr wants to come in.
Yeah, a quick follow-up question. By the way, I do agree with Keith Brown about the incredible potential of Historic Environment Scotland. It's a huge asset. And it's in relation to those assets that I had a follow-up question. As part of your work, you describe in your report a culture of non-compliance. And I'm wondering if you've conducted any kind of a formal review into the governance of health and safety and asset management compliance. The reason I ask that is because earlier this week, because of, again, whistleblowers, it was disclosed that there had been some Legionella issues at Stirling Castle. But other people in the organisation have told me that they know that the asset management compliance team the asset management team at HES have raised, red traffic light reference, red rated concerns about health and safety on many occasions. There is quite a catalogue, I am told. Because I haven't seen any of this, so I'm raising it with you as to whether or not you've looked at this aspect of what you described as a culture of non-compliance, because what I'm told is that those health and safety reports, those concerns about asset safety, have been regularly made over many years and have been routinely set aside and ignored and nothing done with them. Is that something that you've looked at, or is it something you would look at?
I think I'll certainly bring Lisa in very promptly. I think there's a couple of important points maybe to set about what our role is. The first one is on the organisation itself.
Yeah.
We know that there are investigations ongoing, and it's important that those are completed swiftly. From an audit perspective, one of the key parts, so our audit is based around compliance with the Code of Audit Practice that myself and the Accounts Commission set for public auditors in Scotland. And the other is compliance with international standards in auditing. Mm-hmm. One of those standards requires auditors to make an assessment of whether a public body is complying with relevant laws and regulations. And health and safety, clearly for an organisation like Historic Environment Scotland, will be prominent in that. So Lisa can set some of that detail out, but I think it's those two parts, Mr Kerr, that the organisation themselves have to evidence their own compliance with health and safety. And of course, there's a regulator in the Health and Safety Executive who will have a very important role in that respect too. Timing is important here. Many of the issues have come to light during 2025, those concerns. Our audit is typically a retrospective affair, so many of the views in our report take us to the end of March, or when the audit was concluded last year. So there are some live matters, but as Lisa's rightly said, we'll continue to follow up upon these, and as part of our audit and laws and regulations, take a view about the compliance of the public body with its own responsibilities. But again,
I perfectly understand there are so many different aspects of HES that have come under your ever watchful eye, and hence the Section 22. But this is one specific area which I have to confess has come to me very late in terms of this culture of non-compliance. Lisa, do you want to?
Yeah, I suppose, so from my perspective, I'm aware from attendance at the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee that this is, obviously, the issue you're describing.
Yeah.
What I would do is I would point you to Historic Environment Scotland's annual report and financial statements that sets out the principal risks for the organisation, and one of those being health, fire and safety. And just to read from the annual report and financial statements, a programme of work is underway to implement a centralised health, safety and compliance governance system by the 31st of March 2027. So as part of the annual audit, we continue to review all the risks, I suppose, that the organisation is facing, but not all of those fall within the wider scope audit.
So are you confirming that you are aware of this catalogue of, as Audit Scotland? I mean, you're aware of the fact that there is this backlog, catalogue, long-standing concern about non-compliance in the area of asset management compliance?
I'm aware that the organisation has identified a risk, but it's not been an area of focus for the audit.
Yeah. Could it be? Would that be possible? Would you be able to do that?
So I think it's something we can give consideration to also mindful of, as we mentioned once or twice already this morning, but the work of internal audit. Most fundamentally of all, though, this is the responsibility of management to discharge and satisfy themselves that they are managing the resources effectively, but at an absolute minimum that they are meeting health, safety and fire regulations too. I think it goes back to the point perhaps we've spoken about, that leadership, both executive and non-executive of the organisation, if there are some things that are so fundamental that require ongoing close monitoring and attention, and I would agree that health, safety and fire management are at the very top of that list.
I think you put your finger on the issue, though. I mean, it is about I suppose the integrity of the management structures and processes, and the quality of the leadership itself, the personal qualities of leadership that are required. And these are fundamental areas where there has been clearly a long-standing weakness in Hess. And therefore, hence my raising the issue of Audit Scotland, applying its forensic approach to these issues, because, as you say, they are kind of central to this incredible asset base that Hess has a stewardship responsibility for, that Keith Brown quite rightly highlights is Scotland's treasure and something that we should be making the very most of for the good of our country. So that's why I raise it. Is it worth me writing to you separately on that, or is this conversation sufficient?
Well, you're of course more than welcome to, as any member, but I'm very clear on your views. I think as I mentioned to Mr Brown, we're giving consideration to our work programme, and that can encompass the kind of wider, more thematic review, and also there is the option for Lisa during her own audit to monitor, reflect on progress against the recommendations. And then, given, as Lisa's rightly mentioned, the fact that it's identified as a risk, it will be subject to further consideration, I'm sure, by the Audit and Risk Committee and the Management and Board, and we'll give some reflection to what that means for further audit work. I
very much appreciate that, and I raised this at the end of our session because one whistleblower communicated to me, said that they were, and I think this individual is known to me and is genuine, said they were genuinely concerned that one day someone's going to be injured or worse, or at work, or even a visitor, and obviously that would be massively, don't want that. So, I mean, hence the reason I'm raising it, and because of the failures of, the as you describe it, the culture of non-compliance, and this runs pretty deep in this organisation, has done for a while. Thank you.
Unless there are any other questions, I have one final question, Auditor General. Just related to, you'll be aware that we're taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary and his officials next week. What would you wish to hear from the Scottish Government about, I suppose, the governance of Hess and also your findings in your report?
So far be it for me to suggest to the committee how to discharge its work, but I would be interested to know, in terms of the arrangements for a substitute accountable officer convener. I think that, in respect of the role of the Scottish Government, that feels the most pertinent topic. As I mentioned, we'll follow up through our usual channels the progress against the implementation, primarily of the annual audit through HES, but we have ongoing dialogue through our audit of the Scottish Government and the sponsorship arrangements there too. So I'm content that we've got a range of opportunities to do so, and I hope that session goes well with the Scottish Government.
That's helpful. I mean, from your point of view, you still think there's a lack of clarity over that process and why there wasn't the accountability?
Yeah, I hope we've been clear on that, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. Indeed, as I say, I think that concludes our questions. Thank you very much for your contributions, I think, which have been extremely helpful today, and I now close this meeting.